A cargo ship can cross the Pacific Ocean without ever realizing that beneath it, the planet opens into a wound nearly 7 miles deep. No marker, no change in the water above it, nothing to signal that directly below the hull, the seafloor drops deeper than Mount Everest is tall, into a darkness so complete, so pressurized, so removed from everything on the surface that it might as well be another planet. We have sent humans to the moon 6 times. We have mapped the surface of Mars in finer detail than the bottom of this trench. And in all the years since it was first measured, only a handful of descents have ever reached its deepest point. What those descents found, and what the instruments lowered into it have returned, does not always match what the science said should be there. Sounds recorded from the deep that took years to partially explain. Creatures found at depths where biology said survival was impossible. Readings that came back from the bottom and left researchers more uncertain than before they sent the instruments down. Some of what has come out of the Mariana Trench has eventually made sense. Some of it has not. And the scientists who have spent the most time studying it are often the ones most willing to say openly that significant parts of it remain genuinely, completely unknown. So tonight, we are descending into the deepest place on Earth to understand what scientists have discovered there, what they still cannot explain, and why the people who study the trench most closely are often the most comfortable saying that large parts of it remain completely unknown. But before we continue, let me know in the comments if you have any topic suggestions you would like me to cover in future videos. Now, let's descend into the deepest unexplained place on Earth, far below the shipping lanes of the Western Pacific, beyond the storms that pass across the surface, and the slow migration routes of whales moving through open water. The Earth begins to bend inward, east of the Mariana Islands, and roughly 1,580 miles from the Philippines. The seafloor folds into a vast crescent carved over spans of time, almost impossible to picture clearly in the human mind. The Mariana Trench is not a canyon in the ordinary sense. It is a planetary fracture zone, a place where one section of the Earth's crust is slowly disappearing beneath another, descending back into the mantle at a pace so gradual it resembles stillness. The Pacific Plate presses beneath the smaller Mariana Plate at roughly 2.5 inches each year, and this movement has continued for nearly 180 million years, shaping a depression that now stretches approximately 1,580 miles long and 43 miles wide. At its deepest point lies Challenger Deep, a name carried upward from 19th century exploration into a landscape no human eye would ever naturally see. Measurements place this point at approximately 36,070 feet below sea level, deep enough that Mount Everest itself could stand inside the trench with more than a mile of water still above its summit. The scale becomes stranger when imagined in motion. A steel ball dropped from the surface would descend for more than an hour before reaching the bottom, falling through layer after layer of blackening water as the pressure increased with every passing minute. At the floor of Challenger Deep, the weight of the ocean reaches roughly 1,086 bar, close to 1,000 times the atmospheric pressure experienced at sea level. Every square inch endures a force comparable to dozens of fully loaded jumbo jets pressing downward without pause. Human bodies cannot survive such conditions unprotected. Ordinary submarines collapse long before reaching these depths. Even the materials designed for hadal exploration exist close to the edge of their structural limits. Every hull and seal engineered against forces that never stop pressing inward. The cold remains almost perfectly constant. Temperatures hover between 34 and 39 degrees Fahrenheit, only slightly above freezing, suspended in a darkness untouched by sunlight. Beyond roughly 3,300 feet, daylight disappears entirely. There is no dawn or dusk below that threshold, no horizon, no blue glow filtering down from the surface world above. The trench floor exists in permanent night, a landscape illuminated only by brief flashes of bioluminescence or the artificial beams carried downward by visiting machines. For centuries, the trench remained invisible except as an idea inferred from measurements and missing rope. In 1875, the crew of HMS Challenger lowered weighted sounding lines into the Pacific and discovered depths far beyond expectation. The rope continued downward longer than anyone aboard anticipated, unspooling into darkness until the final measurements revealed a depression unlike anything previously recorded in the ocean. More than a century later, sonar mapping began to replace weighted lines, sending pulses of sound through the water and interpreting the returning echoes to construct images of the hidden seafloor. Yet even now, despite satellites orbiting above the planet and robotic vehicles descending into the abyss, less than a quarter of the trench floor has been visually mapped in detail. Large portions remain unseen except as abstractions on acoustic charts, shadowed valleys and ridges interpreted through mathematics rather than direct observation. The deepest place on Earth is still incomplete in human knowledge, not because it is distant, but because the conditions below make every visit slow, expensive, fragile, and uncertain. The trench waits beneath the Pacific exactly as it did long before ships crossed these waters, immense and almost entirely indifferent to the species attempting to understand it. Metal groaned softly through the descent long before the ocean became truly deep. Inside the Trieste, Jacques Picard and Don Walsh sat within a steel sphere barely large enough for the two men and their instruments, surrounded on all sides by walls built to resist a pressure no human body could survive directly. Above them floated a massive tank filled not with air but gasoline, chosen because it compressed less readily than water at extreme depth. The vessel looked improvised, even by the standards of its time, less like a machine designed for exploration than something assembled through stubbornness and engineering intuition. On the morning of January 23, 1960, it began sinking slowly into the Pacific toward a place no human being had ever reached. The descent lasted 4 hours and 47 minutes. During the early stages, sunlight still filtered faintly through the water above them, dissolving into dim blue haze beyond the viewport. Then even that disappeared, leaving only darkness pressing against the outer hull. The deeper the Trieste moved, the more the ocean announced its weight through small sounds, faint creaks traveling through steel joints and support structures. Every component aboard existed beneath forces that increased continuously with depth, the pressure climbing until the surrounding water carried enough weight to crush ordinary submarines instantly. At roughly 30,000 feet, a violent cracking sound exploded through the cabin. One of the outer acrylic viewport layers had fractured under the strain. The noise echoed sharply through the confined sphere, sudden and mechanical in the absolute darkness outside. For a moment the descent paused while the crew checked instruments and evaluated the damage. The inner pressure seal remained intact. The vessel was still holding. After a brief discussion, Picard and Walsh continued downward. Far above them, the Pacific surface carried on unnoticed. Ships crossed open water beneath clouds and sunlight, while the Trieste moved deeper into a region no natural light had touched for geological ages. Eventually the descent slowed. Sediment stirred beneath the vessel as it settled near the floor of Challenger Deep at approximately 35,814 feet below sea level, Within reach of the deepest known point on Earth, they remained there for only 20 minutes. Visibility outside was limited by clouds of fine sediment drifting upward from the landing, illuminated weakly by the submersible lights. The seafloor appeared pale and soft, more like dust than stone, lying motionless beneath unimaginable pressure. Instruments collected measurements, while the crew observed the environment through the small viewport. Then Walsh reported something unexpected moving across the sediment nearby, a flatfish, flounder-shaped, gliding slowly along the bottom. The observation became controversial almost immediately after the dive ended. Flatfish possess skeletal structures and internal physiology considered poorly suited for such immense pressure. Marine biologists questioned whether a vertebrate animal with rigid bone architecture could survive at those depths without catastrophic biochemical failure. Some researchers proposed that Walsh had mistaken another organism for a fish in the drifting sediment clouds stirred by the landing. Others believed the sighting was genuine, an indication that deep ocean biology extended beyond accepted theoretical limits. No flatfish has ever been photographed or recovered from that depth since. Decades of later expeditions failed to confirm the observation conclusively, leaving the report suspended in scientific uncertainty, neither fully accepted nor entirely dismissed. The trench preserved the ambiguity in silence. More than half a century passed before another human returned to the bottom. In 2012, filmmaker and explorer James Cameron descended alone aboard the Deep-Sea Challenger, a narrow vertical submersible engineered with technologies unavailable to the earlier expedition. Cameron spent longer on the trench floor than Piccard and Walsh had managed, but the landscape he described felt profoundly still. The bottom stretched outward as a flat plain of pale sediment, resembling a deserted lunar surface, empty except for drifting particles and occasional small invertebrates. Between those two descents rests an unresolved contrast. One crew reported movement crossing the sediment under the deepest pressure on Earth. Another encountered near total stillness in the same abyssal darkness. The trench offered both accounts without correction, holding each observation quietly within its enormous depth. Long before most people had ever heard the sound itself, the Pacific was already listening. Beneath the surface, anchored across enormous distances of open ocean, hydrophone arrays rested in darkness, recording vibrations that traveled through seawater from storms, earthquakes, whale migrations, collapsing ice, volcanic activity, and the distant movement of submarines. These underwater microphones had originally been constructed during the Cold War, part of a military system designed to track Soviet vessels moving silently through the depths. By the late 1990s, portions of that network had been redirected towards scientific monitoring, transforming instruments of surveillance into instruments of observation. In August of 1997, one of those arrays detected a sound unlike anything previously cataloged. It emerged from the South Pacific as an immense ultra-low frequency pulse, rising gradually in pitch across roughly 1 minute before abruptly ending. The signal carried so efficiently through the ocean that hydrophones separated by nearly 3,000 miles recorded it simultaneously. Analysts reviewing the data could not match the acoustic profile to earthquakes, underwater eruptions, ship engines, or known marine animals. The sound possessed a smooth ascending structure that seemed strangely organic, yet its scale exceeded ordinary biological explanation. Researchers at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration gave it a temporary nickname while studying the recording. They called it the Bloop. The name sounded almost playful beside the enormous uncertainty surrounding the signal itself. Acoustic estimates suggested the source had produced an intensity far beyond the calls of any confirmed living creature. Blue whales, the largest animals known to exist on Earth, generate vocalizations reaching approximately 188 decibels underwater, powerful enough to travel across ocean basins. The bloop appeared substantially louder. Its energy implied something vast, though the ocean offered no visible source to examine, only a spectral pattern etched into the hydrophone record. For years, the recording drifted through both scientific literature and public imagination. Marine acoustics researchers debated whether the signal represented an unusual geological event, an undiscovered cryospheric process, or some unknown biological phenomenon. The sound itself became strangely famous, replayed in documentaries and laboratories alike, often sped upward into the range of human hearing, where it resembled a slow liquid groan echoing through an immense empty chamber. Yet beneath the fascination remained a quieter reality. No confirmed explanation entirely fit the data. 15 years after the original detection, researchers at NOAA announced their most likely conclusion. The bloop, they argued, was probably produced by an icequake, the immense fracturing and scraping of Antarctic icebergs against the seafloor. Similar cryogenic sounds had since been recorded and compared against the 1997 signal, revealing overlapping acoustic characteristics. Large masses of shifting ice can generate surprisingly animal-like frequencies when pressure fractures ripple through them beneath the ocean surface. Even so, the explanation carried imperfections difficult to eliminate completely. The estimated origin point of the bloop lay far from the densest Antarctic ice fields, and the frequency progression did not align perfectly with the signatures produced by documented icequake events. Most researchers accepted the Antarctic explanation as plausible and likely correct, yet a smaller group within marine acoustics continued describing it more cautiously. Not disproven, but incomplete. The ocean itself offered no additional clarification. The bloop was never recorded again. What remained afterward was not silence, but accumulation. As the hydrophone archive expanded, other unexplained sounds emerged from the Pacific Basin. There was the upsweep, a repeating seasonal rise in tone heard since the early 1990s. There was the slowdown, descending gradually through several minutes before fading away. There was the whistle, brief and strangely pure, and the Julia, a low moaning vibration crossing the water for 15 seconds before vanishing back into background noise. Some were tentatively linked to ice movement or geological activity, but none carried complete certainty. The largest acoustic environment on Earth continues speaking constantly beneath the surface, layer upon layer of distant movement carried through cold water across entire oceans. Much of it remains unanalyzed, stored quietly in recordings gathered from depths where no human ear has ever listened directly. The first footage of the animal arrived through drifting particles and artificial light, a pale shape moving calmly across the trench as though the immense pressure surrounding it were ordinary. In 2023, researchers operating deep ocean cameras in the Mariana Trench recorded a small snailfish at approximately 27,349 feet below sea level, deeper than any fish had ever been filmed before. It did not resemble the strong, muscular forms usually associated with life in the sea. The body appeared almost unfinished, translucent and delicate, with soft skin, a rounded head, and no visible scales. Its movements were unhurried, small amphipods scattered around it across the sediment, while the fish fed casually in complete darkness. At that depth, the surrounding pressure exceeds anything encountered naturally by surface vertebrates. Human bone would fracture quickly under such force without protection. Most familiar marine anatomy fails long before reaching the hadal zone. Gas-filled cavities collapse, proteins lose their structure, and cellular chemistry begins to break apart under the enormous compression of the surrounding water. Yet the snailfish moved through the trench floor with the ease of an animal entirely shaped by that environment, not merely surviving within it, but built from the beginning for conditions almost impossible elsewhere on Earth. Its existence challenges a limit scientists once believed relatively firm. Fish living in deep water rely on a compound called trimethylamine oxide, often shortened to TMAO, which stabilizes proteins against pressure-induced distortion. Proteins are delicate molecular structures folded into precise shapes. Under extreme compression, those shapes begin to deform, interrupting the biochemical reactions necessary for life. TMAO acts almost like a protective brace at the molecular level, helping proteins maintain their function as pressure increases with depth. Among deep-sea fish, TMAO concentration rises steadily the deeper a species lives. For years, researchers believed this relationship pointed toward a natural ceiling, beyond which vertebrate life could no longer function. At sufficiently high concentrations, TMAO itself begins interfering with cellular processes, creating a biochemical contradiction. Too little, and proteins fail under pressure. Too much, and the chemistry of the cell destabilizes for other reasons. Calculations place this theoretical boundary at approximately 27,000 feet. The Mariana snailfish was filmed beyond that threshold. Exactly how its cells continue functioning remains uncertain. Some researchers suspect the fish possesses previously unknown pressure-adapted proteins, requiring lower concentrations of TMAO. Others believe additional biochemical stabilizers may exist within its tissues, compounds not yet fully identified or understood. The animal appears to inhabit a narrow zone near the absolute pressure limit for vertebrate life, existing precisely where theoretical biology begins losing confidence in its own predictions. Its anatomy reflects the same strange compromise between fragility and resilience. The bones are thin, partially unfused, and nearly transparent, reducing rigid stress points that might otherwise crack under pressure. Rather than resisting compression through hardness, the skull flexes slightly with the surrounding force. The fish has also abandoned the swim bladder found in most shallow water species. Near the surface, this gas-filled organ controls buoyancy, but at hadal depths, any enclosed gas volume would implode instantly. The snailfish drifts instead through subtle adjustments in body density and movement, carried through black water without internal air spaces. Vision contributes little in an environment where sunlight never arrives. Along the sides of the fish runs an enlarged lateral line system, a network of sensory organs capable of detecting minute pressure disturbances in the water. Tiny vibrations from moving prey travel outward through the trench, allowing the animal to navigate and hunt by touch at a distance, reading shifts in the surrounding water the way surface creatures interpret light. What makes the footage especially striking is not struggle, but normality. The fish does not appear stressed by its surroundings. It feeds, turns, and searches the sediment with the calm efficiency of a species entirely at home in a world once considered biochemically unreachable. Somewhere near the deepest limits of vertebrate existence, evolution continued quietly past the point where human calculations expected it to stop. They gather first around anything that falls. A drifting carcass, a fragment of organic debris, even the bait lowered by research landers into the trench eventually becomes surrounded by restless movement as pale bodies emerge from the darkness. Amphipods are among the most common scavengers of the hadal zone. Small crustaceans, distantly resembling shrimp, moving in quick bursts across sediment that receives only scattered nutrition from the world far above. In most oceans, they remain tiny creatures, often measuring little more than a centimeter or two in length, fragile enough to disappear unnoticed among grains of sand or folds of seaweed. But in the Mariana Trench, some species grow to astonishing proportions, reaching nearly 34 centimeters long, large enough to fill an adult human hand. This enlargement belongs to a phenomenon known as deep-sea gigantism, one of the stranger recurring patterns in abyssal biology. Certain organisms living at extreme depth develop bodies far larger than their shallow water relatives, though the reasons remain unsettled despite decades of study. Cold temperatures, slow metabolism, and may favor larger forms capable of storing energy efficiently for long periods between meals. Immense pressure alters cellular behavior in ways not fully understood. Scarce food encourages organisms to consume and retain whatever nutrients become available. Reduced predation may also remove some evolutionary pressure favoring small body size. None of these explanations fully resolves the pattern on its own. The trench continues producing oversized scavengers without offering a single clear reason for why it happens. Under artificial lights, the giant amphipods appear almost translucent, their segmented bodies bending and curling across the seafloor while sensitive antennae sweep continuously through the water. They feed on nearly anything organic reaching the trench floor: whale remains, dead fish, sinking plankton, fragments of marine snow descending slowly through miles of ocean. In doing so, they consume not only the remains of life from above, but also the chemical residue of industrial civilization carried downward over generations. In 2014, researchers collected amphipods from the Mariana Trench and analyzed the compounds accumulating inside their tissues. What they found altered assumptions about even the most remote environments on Earth. The amphipods contained high concentrations of polychlorinated biphenyls, industrial chemicals once widely used in electrical equipment and manufacturing processes before being banned globally during the 1970s due to toxicity and environmental persistence. These compounds do not disappear easily. They circulate through ecosystems, attach themselves to organic particles, and gradually settle downward through the ocean over decades. The concentrations measured inside the trench amphipods exceeded expectations dramatically. In some cases, the levels were roughly 50 times higher than those found in crabs inhabiting heavily polluted river systems near industrial regions of China. The deepest known ecosystem on Earth, separated from sunlight by nearly 7 miles of water, carried contamination greater than some of the most visibly damaged surface environments. The trench itself helps create this accumulation. Its immense crescent shape acts as a collection basin for the Pacific, funneling sinking organic matter downward, where it settles into sediments and enters the food web. Every fragment drifting slowly through the water column eventually reaches some final resting place. Over time, microscopic pollutants descend alongside dead plankton and biological debris, becoming woven into the chemistry of hadal life. In 2020, another study examined amphipods recovered from Challenger Deep and found microplastics inside nearly every digestive tract sampled. Tiny synthetic particles, produced through the breakdown of larger plastic waste near the surface, had traveled through the ocean and into organisms living at the greatest depth known on Earth. In the cold stability of the trench, where sunlight never penetrates and decomposition slows almost to stillness, many of those materials may persist for geological timescales. What these contaminants are doing to deep ocean biology remains uncertain. Scientists possess no historical baseline from before industrial pollution entered the sea. By the time systematic sampling of hadal organisms became possible, the contamination had already arrived. The amphipods moving quietly through the trench today carry not only the chemistry of their ancient environment, but traces of factories, electrical systems, discarded packaging, and human industry settling invisibly through the Pacific for generations. At first glance, they resemble fragments of the seafloor itself, pale shapes resting motionless among the sediment as though assembled accidentally from loose debris drifting through the trench. Cameras descending into the Mariana depths often passed over them for years without fully understanding what they were. In 2011, a remotely operated vehicle, exploring near 34,596 feet below sea level, recorded clearer observations of these strange organisms scattered across the trench floor. They were xenophyophores, among the least familiar forms of life ever discovered in the deep ocean. And despite their appearance, each one was a single living cell. That fact remains difficult to hold clearly in the mind. A xenophyophore is not a colony of many cells working together like coral or sponge tissue. It is one cell, expanded to extraordinary scale, large enough to be seen easily without magnification. Some grow beyond 4 inches in diameter, approaching the size of a tennis ball, while still technically remaining a single continuous organism. On the seafloor, they resemble intricate lumps of pale sediment, fragile and irregular, their surfaces built from particles gathered slowly from the surrounding environment. The trench floor provides little stability, and the xenophyophores respond by constructing protective shells around themselves from whatever material settles nearby. Mineral grains, fragments of sediment, microscopic shell remains from other organisms all become incorporated into delicate outer structures cemented together by secreted organic compounds. The finished forms appear less like animals than small abandoned ruins, rough, textured, and asymmetrical, lying quietly beneath immense pressure where few larger creatures disturb them. Inside those structures, the cell extends branching masses of living material through intricate internal chambers. Nutrients drift inward slowly from surrounding sediment, while waste products move outward again through the same labyrinthine pathways. The pace of life at hadal depth is already slow compared to surface ecosystems, but xenophyophores seem especially patient organisms, existing in near stillness while processing the thin trickle of resources reaching the trench floor. What makes them even stranger is the chemistry accumulating within their bodies. Analyses of collected specimens revealed concentrations of heavy metals at levels thousands of times greater than those present in surrounding sediment. Uranium, mercury, and lead become absorbed and retained inside the organism in remarkable quantities. Researchers still do not know whether this accumulation serves some biological purpose or occurs incidentally as the cells process mineral-rich sediment continuously over long periods of time. No confirmed metabolic function has been linked to the metals. The xenophyophores simply continue collecting them in silence beneath the Pacific. For decades, scientists struggled even to classify these organisms correctly. Their unusual anatomy resisted simple placement within established biological categories. Some researchers initially believed they belonged among sponges or other multicellular life forms because of their size and external appearance. Others argued they represented giant amoeboid protists, single-celled organisms expanded far beyond ordinary dimensions. Reclassification followed reclassification as microscopy and genetic analysis gradually clarified their structure. Even now, xenophyophores remain among the more elusive branches of the deep ocean tree of life, organisms so unfamiliar that biology required years merely to decide what they fundamentally were. Much about their existence remains unresolved. They reproduce, somehow, within the trench, yet no direct observation has captured the process. Scientists have not witnessed how one xenophyophore produces another at hadal depth, whether through division, dispersal of reproductive particles, or some slower mechanism still undocumented. Their lifespans are also uncertain. Some may persist for extremely long periods in the cold stability of the abyss, growing gradually while the surrounding sediment accumulates millimeter by millimeter over centuries. Small organisms gather around them continuously. Amphipods move between their outer structures, and tiny invertebrates shelter among the mineral chambers the cells create. In this way, xenophyophores may serve as foundational habitat within parts of the trench ecosystem, creating complexity across an otherwise soft and relatively featureless seafloor. Yet the broader ecological role remains largely unmapped. Researchers know these giant cells are present in great numbers across some hadal environments, but the full extent of their influence has never been traced completely. On the deepest floor of the Pacific, where even vertebrate life approaches its theoretical limits, some of the largest living structures belong not to animals with organs or skeletons, but to solitary cells quietly building mineral homes in darkness older than human civilization. Temperature usually behaves with quiet predictability in the ocean. Near the surface, sunlight warms the upper layers, while deeper water grows steadily colder as depth increases. By the time seawater reaches the hadal zone of the Mariana Trench, it hovers only slightly above freezing, preserved in darkness beneath immense pressure and isolated from the atmosphere for centuries at a time. The descent toward the trench floor should therefore follow a relatively stable thermal pattern, each layer gradually colder than the one above it. Yet, scattered through parts of the trench are places where that pattern weakens unexpectedly. During multiple survey dives, research instruments moving through the water column detected localized pockets of warmer water resting among the surrounding cold. These were not dramatic increases capable of being felt directly by human skin, but measurable anomalies appearing repeatedly within specific zones at extreme depth. In some locations, the water temperature differed by several degrees from nearby surroundings only a short distance away. The changes persisted across repeated observations rather than dispersing quickly, like temporary disturbances created by passing currents or equipment movement. The first explanation seemed straightforward. Warm water at great depth often points toward hydrothermal activity, places where seawater seeps downward through cracks in the crust, becomes heated by underlying geology, then rises back upward, carrying dissolved minerals and gases from deep within the earth. Hydrothermal vents elsewhere in the ocean create entire ecosystems independent of sunlight, sustaining dense microbial communities and unusual animals through chemical energy released from the planet itself. But the warmer zones in the Mariana Trench introduced complications difficult to resolve cleanly. No confirmed hydrothermal vents have been identified in several of the areas where the strongest anomalies were recorded. Traditional vent systems also produce chemically distinctive water, enriched with sulfur compounds, dissolved metals, and altered gas concentrations. Samples collected from some Mariana anomaly zones did not consistently match those expected chemical signatures. The water was warmer, but not fully characteristic of known vent emissions. A survey conducted in 2016 documented temperature differences approaching 4 degrees Fahrenheit between measurements taken only meters apart at hadal depth. In the cold stability of the trench, where conditions normally change slowly across large distances. Such variation remains difficult to explain through ordinary circulation alone. The anomalies appeared anchored to specific regions rather than drifting freely with currents, suggesting some persistent local source beneath or within the surrounding geology. At the same time, microbial activity in these warmer pockets appears elevated compared to nearby areas. Sediment samples and water chemistry indicate increased biological processing, as though microscopic communities are responding to an additional energy source unavailable in colder surrounding zones. Deep ocean microbes survive by exploiting faint chemical gradients wherever they emerge, feeding on sulfur, ammonia, iron, methane, and other compounds released through geological processes. Their concentration near the anomalies suggests the trench may be offering subtle forms of chemical nourishment not yet fully identified. Beneath all of this lies the immense tectonic engine that formed the trench itself. The Pacific Plate continues sliding beneath the Mariana Plate, deep below the seafloor, carrying water-rich crust downward into the mantle through a process still incompletely modeled, even with modern geophysics. Rocks fracture, compress, heat, and release fluids under pressures difficult to reproduce experimentally. Small shifts within this subduction system may generate localized frictional heating or open pathways, allowing warm, chemically altered fluids to migrate upward through hidden faults and porous sediment layers. The challenge is scale. Much of the trench remains sparsely instrumented, and deep ocean measurements are difficult to maintain continuously across such hostile conditions. A temperature anomaly recorded during one expedition may remain unvisited for years before another vehicle returns to the same coordinates. By then, the system may have changed subtly again, obscured beneath currents, sediment movement, and the slow geological motion shaping the Pacific floor. For now, the warmer pockets remain suspended between explanations. They may represent undiscovered hydrothermal systems, buried beneath sediment, or hidden within trench walls beyond current mapping resolution. They may emerge from tectonic friction deep below the seabed, releasing faint heat into ancient water moving through fractured rock. Or they may belong to geological processes not yet fully recognized within subduction environments of such extreme depth. In the deepest cold of the Mariana Trench, certain regions continue holding small reservoirs of unexplained warmth, quietly altering the chemistry of the surrounding darkness. Far above the trench, in the illuminated layers of the Pacific, life begins in sunlight. Microscopic phytoplankton drift near the surface, converting solar energy into organic matter, forming the foundation of nearly every marine food chain on Earth. Fish consume smaller fish, whales filter enormous clouds of plankton, predators follow migrations across entire oceans, and eventually fragments from all of it begin descending slowly downward. By the time those remains reach the deepest parts of the Mariana Trench, they have crossed through miles of water and passed through countless mouths along the way. The region below, approximately 20,000 feet, is known as the Hadal Zone, named after Hades, the underworld of ancient Greek mythology. The Mariana Trench forms the largest and deepest hadal environment on Earth, a place where ordinary ecological assumptions begin to loosen under pressure and darkness. Sunlight-driven photosynthesis does not occur here. No green plants grow across the sediment. No algae blooms drift through the abyss. The primary engine powering surface ecosystems disappears completely long before the trench floor begins. For decades, the accepted explanation for hadal survival seemed relatively simple. Life at extreme depth persists on marine snow, the slow, continual fall of organic material sinking from upper ocean layers. Tiny particles descend constantly through the water column: dead plankton, microscopic fecal pellets, shed skin cells, fragments of decaying animals, drifting mucus aggregates, and faint biological debris too small to notice individually. Most of it sinks gradually over weeks or months, consumed repeatedly by organisms at different depths before the final remnants approach the trench floor. The shape of the Mariana Trench appears well suited to collecting this material. Its vast crescent structure acts almost like a basin, concentrating descending particles as they settle downward into the deepest regions. Marine snow gathers there more efficiently than across flatter abyssal plains, accumulating in soft sediment layers where scavengers, microbes, and invertebrates feed upon the remains of surface life transported from far above. Yet over time, measurements from trench expeditions began revealing a quiet inconsistency. The amount of organic matter predicted to reach the hadal zone did not appear sufficient to support the density of life actually observed there. Each stage of descent through the ocean removes energy from the falling material. Countless organisms intercept and consume particles before they can travel deeper. By the time marine snow reaches Challenger Deep, theoretical models suggest relatively little usable energy should remain. But the trench floor does not behave like an ecosystem, surviving at the edge of starvation alone. Amphipods gather rapidly around bait deployments. Snailfish patrol the sediment with apparent abundance. Microbial communities thrive beneath the seafloor itself. Biomass estimates repeatedly exceed what standard marine snow calculations predict should be possible. The mathematics describing energy input and the living system observed at depth do not align perfectly. One possible explanation rises from chemistry rather than sunlight. Certain microbes can sustain themselves through chemosynthesis, extracting energy from chemical reactions involving sulfur compounds, methane, ammonia, iron, and other minerals released through geological processes. At hydrothermal vents elsewhere in the ocean, chemosynthetic ecosystems support dense biological communities entirely independent of solar energy. Giant tube worms, vent shrimp, and microbial mats flourish in darkness by feeding from the chemistry of the Earth itself. Some researchers suspect similar processes may supplement the hadal food web beyond known vent systems. The Mariana Trench sits within an active tectonic environment where subducting crust, fractured rock, and fluid movement may release chemically rich compounds into surrounding sediments and water. Microbial populations associated with warmer anomaly zones hint at hidden sources of chemical energy operating quietly beneath the trench floor. The evidence, however, remains incomplete. Confirmed chemosynthetic ecosystems are well documented around active hydrothermal vents, but widespread non-vent chemosynthesis across the broader hadal environment has not yet been demonstrated conclusively. The trench continues offering signs of additional energy pathways without fully revealing how extensive they are or how much biological productivity they support. For now, the deepest ecosystem on Earth exists with an unresolved accounting problem. The observable life within the Mariana Trench appears richer than conventional energy supply models comfortably explain. Somewhere between falling organic debris, microbial chemistry, geological activity, and processes still poorly understood, enough energy enters the abyss to sustain a living system spread across one of the most isolated environments on the planet. Most of the Mariana Trench has never been seen directly by human eyes. Even now, the majority of its landscape exists first as sound, translated through mathematics into maps, assembled aboard research vessels drifting far above the abyss. Modern expeditions rely heavily on multi-beam echo sounders, instruments mounted beneath ships that send broad fans of acoustic pulses downward through the Pacific. The sound waves spread outward, strike the seafloor, then return upward, carrying information about depth, slope, texture, and shape. Computers transform those returning echoes into three-dimensional reconstructions of terrain hidden beneath miles of water. In calm conditions, the process produces remarkably detailed images. Ridges emerge from darkness. Sediment plains reveal subtle contours. Trench walls appear as immense descending escarpments, folding into one another beneath the Pacific crust. Yet, occasionally, the returning echoes do something unexpected. Instead of reflecting cleanly from the bottom, portions of the acoustic signal rebound from somewhere suspended between the surface and the trench floor itself. Survey operators have recorded these mid-water returns during multiple expeditions across different sections of the trench. At first glance, such anomalies can resemble instrument noise or interference, transient distortions generated by shifting currents, electronic faults, or bubbles in the water column. But several of the recorded returns persisted across repeated survey passes in approximately the same locations, reducing the likelihood of simple equipment malfunction. The echoes behaved like physical targets, occupying real positions within the water column. The acoustic signatures did not correspond neatly to known geological structures. They also failed to resemble the sonar patterns expected from schools of fish, aggregations of whales, or underwater terrain features extending upward from the seafloor. Some appeared elongated and diffuse. Others produced denser returns, with boundaries difficult to interpret clearly. In several cases, the anomalies seemed to shift position between survey passes conducted hours or days apart, suggesting movement rather than fixed geological origin. Oceanographers are familiar with one major phenomenon capable of creating false sonar bottoms. Known as the deep scattering layer, it forms when vast concentrations of marine organisms gather densely enough to reflect acoustic signals collectively. Fish with gas-filled swim bladders, squid, crustaceans, and gelatinous animals can produce a broad reflective layer, appearing almost like solid terrain on sonar displays. During daylight hours, this living layer often remains hundreds or thousands of feet below the surface before migrating upward at night to feed. But the anomalous returns recorded in the Mariana surveys occurred far below the normal depth range of the known deep scattering layer. Some appeared deep within the hadal water column itself, well beneath regions where large migrating biomass concentrations are typically observed. At those depths, the pressure eliminates gas-filled structures in most organisms, reducing the strength of ordinary biological sonar reflections. The echoes therefore occupy an uncertain category, neither clearly geological nor comfortably biological, according to current interpretations. Part of the difficulty lies in the limitations of the technology itself. Sonar does not produce direct visual observation. It creates interpretations from reflected sound, patterns reconstructed mathematically from echoes moving through water under varying temperature, pressure, and salinity conditions. Small changes in those conditions alter how sound bends and scatters across extreme depth. The trench is also acoustically complex, its walls and irregular topography capable of redirecting signals in unusual ways that remain difficult to model perfectly. Even so, the repeated nature of some returns has kept them present within technical discussions and survey archives. Operators document coordinates, depth estimates, and acoustic characteristics before moving on with broader mapping objectives. No remotely operated vehicle has yet been dispatched specifically to the exact coordinates of one of these anomalies during an active detection event. The logistical challenge of placing an ROV precisely within a shifting target zone, thousands of feet below a moving vessel, remains considerable, especially in one of the least accessible environments on Earth. As a result, the anomalies persist quietly inside scientific literature as unresolved observations rather than dramatic mysteries. They remain cataloged in sonar records, acknowledged without definitive explanation. Somewhere between the trench floor and the distant surface, sound occasionally returns from forms or structures that existing categories do not fully describe, brief acoustic silhouettes suspended in darkness before dissolving again into the larger silence of the Pacific. The sediment at the bottom of the Mariana Trench appears still at first, a soft accumulation of particles settling gradually through the Pacific over immense spans of time. Research vehicles descending into the abyss often illuminate only smooth plains of pale mud stretching outward beneath the water, seemingly inactive except for the occasional movement of scavengers crossing the surface. Yet beneath those upper layers, hidden inside compacted sediment compressed under miles of ocean, entire microbial worlds continue functioning slowly beyond ordinary biological expectations. During the 1990s, microbiologists began extracting long sediment cores from the trench floor, cylindrical samples pulled upward carefully from the hadal seabed. The original goal was modest: to examine chemical composition and search for traces of microbial activity near the surface layers where organic material first accumulated. What emerged instead transformed scientific understanding of how deeply life could persist beneath the ocean floor itself. Living microbial communities were discovered not only across the sediment surface, but extending meters downward into the compacted layers below. These organisms existed in conditions approaching biological minimalism, near freezing temperatures, immense pressure, almost complete nutrient scarcity, and total absence of sunlight. Many were not dormant. They were metabolically active, processing chemicals, repairing cellular damage, and reproducing at rates so slow they altered conventional ideas about the tempo of life. Some trench microbes are estimated to divide only once across spans of thousands of years. A single cell may spend centuries accumulating enough energy for reproduction, surviving through biochemical processes operating at speeds almost imperceptible compared to surface organisms. By human standards, they appear nearly immortal, persisting through historical eras while remaining buried beneath sediment, untouched by light or weather. Entire civilizations rose and disappeared above the Pacific, while these microbial populations continued their gradual, invisible metabolism below the trench floor. Their chemistry also differs profoundly from the familiar biological pathways dominating surface ecosystems. Most life near the surface ultimately depends upon sunlight transformed through photosynthesis into usable energy. Hadal microbes instead exploit chemical reactions drawn directly from surrounding minerals and sediment compounds. Some oxidize ammonia, others process sulfur compounds or dissolved iron, moving slowly through pore water trapped between sediment grains. These reactions release faint amounts of energy, enough for organisms adapted to extreme efficiency and extraordinarily slow metabolism. Genetic analysis revealed another surprise. Several microbes recovered from Mariana sediment belonged to previously unknown phyla, entire major branches of the tree of life with no known representatives elsewhere. The trench was not merely preserving unusual versions of familiar organisms. It contained biological lineages so isolated and poorly understood that classification systems required expansion to accommodate them. Hidden beneath the Pacific seafloor existed forms of life that had remained evolutionarily invisible until sediment cores finally brought traces of them upward into laboratories. As research expanded across other deep ocean environments, scientists began recognizing the broader scale of this hidden biosphere. A study published in 2020 estimated that microbial biomass buried within deep marine sediments globally may equal or even exceed the total biomass of all surface life combined. The implication altered the perceived balance of life on Earth itself. Forests, grasslands, coral reefs, and animal populations occupying the visible planet may represent only part of a much larger biological system extending silently through the sediments beneath the oceans. The trench microbes have also become valuable far beyond marine biology. Their enzymes continue functioning under pressures and conditions that disable ordinary biological molecules, making them useful for industrial chemistry and pharmaceutical research. Scientists study these pressure-stable proteins in hopes of designing catalysts capable of operating under extreme manufacturing environments where conventional enzymes fail. Some compounds isolated from deep ocean microbes are already used commercially in polymerase chain reaction testing, including diagnostic systems developed during the global COVID-19 pandemic. There is something quietly remarkable about that connection. Molecular machinery evolved beneath nearly 7 miles of Pacific water, inside ancient sediment compressed under immense pressure, eventually became useful within hospitals and research laboratories at the surface. The trench does not simply contain organisms surviving at the edge of possibility. It contains biochemical systems unlike any previously known, operating according to rhythms so slow and isolated that biology itself required revision after finally discovering them buried in darkness below the seafloor. The bait descends slowly through the Pacific, attached to cables or landers, carrying the scent of organic matter downward into darkness, untouched by sunlight. Hours later, long after the equipment settles across the trench floor, pale bodies begin appearing at the edge of the camera lights. They emerge gradually from beyond visibility, small hadal snailfish moving through the water above the sediment with soft undulating motions, their translucent forms drifting closer until entire groups gather around the bait in coordinated clusters. Before deep camera deployments became common in hadal research, scientists assumed fish living at such depths would behave mostly as solitary opportunists, scattered thinly across an environment where food arrives rarely and unpredictably. The trench seemed too vast and nutritionally sparse to support complex behavioral organization among vertebrates. Yet footage from the Mariana Trench began suggesting something more structured. Multiple snailfish often arrived within relatively short periods after bait deployments, not randomly dispersed across days, but converging with surprising consistency upon the same location. Their speed of arrival raised difficult questions about how information travels through the hadal zone. Dissolved organic compounds leaking from bait diffuse slowly through the water, yet snailfish frequently appear within hours despite the enormous surrounding volume of the trench. One possibility is that the fish possess an extraordinarily sensitive chemosensory system capable of detecting minute concentrations of organic molecules across long distances. Another possibility is behavioral rather than sensory, that the fish move continuously through overlapping patrol territories near the seafloor, increasing the likelihood of rapid discovery whenever food appears. Their anatomy supports both interpretations. Along the sides of the body runs a highly developed lateral line system, a network of pressure-sensitive organs far more pronounced than in many shallow water relatives. Through this system, the fish detect faint water disturbances, tiny vibrations and subtle pressure gradients generated by movement nearby. In the absence of light, the surrounding water itself becomes a medium of information. Every shifting current, struggling amphipod, or descending object alters the pressure landscape around the animal. What researchers did not expect was the apparent coordination emerging once multiple individuals gathered together. Deep camera footage has captured snailfish clustering tightly around bait, then dispersing outward before regrouping again in shifting formations. Some individuals appear to hold position, while others circle slowly through the water nearby. At times, the groups reorganize almost simultaneously, movements rippling across several fish at once, as though triggered by shared awareness rather than isolated reaction. Whether this represents genuine social behavior remains uncertain. It may simply reflect multiple individuals responding independently to identical sensory cues within a confined feeding area. The fish could be reacting only to changes in water chemistry or pressure caused by feeding activity around the bait. Yet some marine biologists studying the footage believe the movements suggest a more coordinated pattern, subtle signaling behaviors operating through body positioning, vibration sensing, or hydrodynamic cues impossible for human observers to perceive directly. The hadal environment complicates interpretation because almost every assumption about vertebrate behavior at depth was originally formed without direct observation. Until recent decades, no technology existed capable of recording long-duration footage across the deepest regions of the ocean. The snailfish therefore emerged not merely as a new species, but as an animal performing behaviors scientists had never expected to witness under such conditions. Despite their soft appearance, these fish occupy the highest vertebrate position within the Mariana food web. In terms of vertebrate biomass, hadal snailfish dominate the deepest known ecosystem on Earth. They feed heavily on amphipods and other invertebrates concentrated along the trench floor, functioning as apex predators in an environment where large active hunters are otherwise absent. No shark patrols these depths. No giant squid drifts through Challenger Deep. The dominant fish of the hadal zone is small, translucent, and delicate-looking. Its body shaped more like an unfinished larval form than the ruler of an abyssal ecosystem. Yet evolution rarely follows human expectation. In the immense pressure and darkness of the Mariana Trench, power belongs not to strength or speed in the familiar sense, but to efficiency, sensory precision, and the ability to locate nourishment across one of the most isolated environments on Earth. The pale snailfish drifting quietly through the hadal zone has become perfectly suited to that role. A fragile-looking animal reigning calmly over the deepest hunting grounds on the planet. Long after research vessels leave the Mariana Trench, many of their instruments remain below in darkness, continuing to record quietly across the seafloor. Deep ocean science depends heavily on machines called landers, free-falling platforms equipped with cameras, pressure sensors, sediment samplers, bait containers, and acoustic transmitters. Unlike crude submersibles or tethered remotely operated vehicles, landers descend alone. They are released from the surface and sink gradually through the water column until ballast weights carry them to the trench floor, where they remain for hours or days collecting information in isolation. Recovery depends upon sound. When researchers are ready to retrieve the platform, the ship above transmits an acoustic release signal downward through the ocean. If the system functions properly, the lander responds automatically by dropping its ballast weights. Freed from the heavy mass anchoring it to the bottom, the platform becomes positively buoyant and begins rising slowly back toward the surface, carrying its recorded data upward from the abyss. Most of the time, the process works. Sometimes it does not. Several landers deployed within the Mariana system have simply failed to return. Researchers transmit the release code repeatedly and wait for confirmation pings from below, but no response arrives through the water. The silence itself reveals very little. A failed recovery could result from damaged electronics, exhausted batteries, mechanical malfunction, or acoustic shadowing created by the complex topography of the trench walls. Sound traveling through hadal environments bends and scatters unpredictably across changing pressure layers and steep geological relief. A signal may never reach the instrument clearly, or the response may never return intact to the ship above. In certain cases, the missing landers eventually reappeared, though not where they had originally settled. Days after deployment, tracking equipment located some platforms miles from their intended positions along the trench floor. The displacement implied the presence of deep currents, stronger and more organized than many models had predicted. Hadal water had often been imagined as relatively still compared to shallower ocean layers, but the drifting landers suggested active movement along the trench itself, currents capable of pushing heavy equipment slowly across the sea floor, beneath nearly 7 miles of water. One particularly puzzling recovery deepened the uncertainty further. Researchers eventually located a lander resting on the bottom with its ballast weights still attached, while the release mechanism remained in the fired position. In other words, the instrument had received the acoustic command and attempted to free itself, but the weights had failed to detach completely. Something had prevented ascent even after the recovery sequence activated correctly. Several explanations remain possible. The platform may have settled partially into extremely soft sediment during deployment, allowing mud and pressure to trap portions of the ballast assembly beneath the trench floor. Mechanical deformation under hadal pressure may also have altered small structural tolerances enough to jam the release system despite successful activation. Another possibility involves hydrodynamic force itself. Deep currents moving along the trench may have pinned or shifted the lander against uneven terrain after release, exceeding design assumptions developed from shallower environments. What makes these failures difficult to resolve is how little direct information exists about fluid movement at full hadal depth. Sustained current monitoring in the trench remains technologically challenging. Instruments capable of operating reliably for long periods beneath such pressure are still relatively rare, and deployments often focus on biological or geological objectives rather than continuous hydrodynamic mapping. As a result, the trench floor remains poorly characterized not only biologically, but physically. Water itself may move through the abyss in ways still only partially measured. The ocean at those depths is not motionless. Dense ancient water flows slowly through narrow topography carved by tectonic forces over millions of years. Sediment shifts, pressure gradients evolve. Internal tides generated by distant surface processes propagate invisibly downward through the water column. All of this occurs in darkness beyond ordinary observation, interacting continuously with equipment designed by engineers working from incomplete environmental knowledge. Each missing lander becomes a quiet reminder of that uncertainty. Instruments descend carrying cameras and sensors meant to study the trench, yet sometimes the trench studies the instruments instead, exposing weaknesses in assumptions about pressure, current, sediment, and sound. Even simple retrieval remains partly experimental in the deepest environment on Earth, where machines occasionally disappear into the Pacific floor and answer no further calls from above. For much of modern science, sunlight was treated as the unquestioned beginning of complex life. Every major ecosystem on Earth appeared tied directly or indirectly, to the energy arriving from the Sunday. Forests, coral reefs, grasslands, plankton blooms, all ultimately depended upon photosynthesis, converting light into biological fuel. Then, in 1977, researchers exploring the seafloor near the Galapagos Islands encountered something that disrupted that assumption entirely. Along volcanic hydrothermal vents rising from the deep ocean floor, they found dense living communities thriving in complete darkness. The discovery altered biology permanently. Giant tube worms, pale crabs, clams, shrimp, and dense microbial mats surrounded the vents, supported not by sunlight, but by chemistry emerging directly from the Earth itself. Superheated water carrying dissolved minerals and sulfur compounds flowed upward through fractures in the crust, and microbes learned to harvest energy from those reactions through chemosynthesis. Entire food webs existed independent of solar energy, powered instead by the planet's internal geology. As exploration expanded across the oceans, similar hydrothermal vent systems were identified along mid-ocean ridges where tectonic plates pull apart and magma rises toward the seafloor. The geology fit existing expectations. Rifting environments naturally create fractures, allowing heated fluids to circulate upward, but the Mariana system complicated the pattern. The trench exists not at a spreading center, but at a subduction zone where one tectonic plate descends beneath another. The forces involved are compressional rather than extensional. Crust bends downward into the mantle instead of separating apart. For years, that geological distinction made large vent systems seem less likely within the Mariana region itself, yet the trench continued resisting simple assumptions. In 2016, researchers confirmed active hydrothermal venting within an area known as the Mariana Back Arc, a tectonically complex region associated with the broader Mariana system. Heated fluids emerged from the seafloor there, carrying a chemistry unlike the better-known vent fields elsewhere in the Pacific and Atlantic. The water temperatures were generally lower than those measured at classic black smoker vents along spreading ridges. Mineral compositions also differed, shaped by the unusual chemistry of subducting crust and surrounding volcanic processes. Microbial communities colonizing these vents displayed distinct metabolic patterns adapted to the local environment. Some microbial mats contained organisms with no close-known relatives anywhere else in the ocean, isolated branches of deep life flourishing around chemical gradients hidden beneath the Pacific. Around these vent systems gathered familiar ecological roles expressed through unfamiliar species. Shrimp clustered across mineral surfaces. Snails grazed near microbial films. Tube worms extended pale bodies into chemically altered water flowing upward from the crust. Yet the species composition differed significantly from vent communities observed elsewhere. The organisms filling these niches were not simply transplanted versions of Atlantic or Eastern Pacific vent fauna. Evolution in the Mariana system appeared to have produced its own variations on deep ocean ecological structure. Scientists remain uncertain whether these similarities represent parallel evolution, separate lineages independently adapting toward comparable roles under similar environmental pressures, or whether the Mariana organisms descend from much older ancestral populations isolated for immense periods by depth and geographic distance. The trench system sits far from many other major vent regions, separated by vast stretches of deep ocean where conditions differ dramatically. Isolation across geological time may have allowed certain lineages to diverge almost entirely from their distant relatives elsewhere in the sea. The communities themselves remain only briefly observed. Fewer than a dozen direct visits have documented some of these vent systems. Each expedition lasts only a limited period before vehicles must ascend again toward the surface. Between visits, the ecosystems continue in darkness unobserved, shaped by chemical flows and geological forces still poorly mapped in detail. What makes these environments especially striking is their contradiction of ordinary expectation. In one of the deepest and most isolated regions on Earth, life gathers not around sunlight, but around fractures in the crust, releasing heat and chemistry upward from beneath the seafloor. The trench contains ecosystems whose primary energy source comes not from the sky above the Pacific, but from tectonic processes unfolding deep within the Earth itself. Slow geological reactions, feeding organisms that may exist nowhere else on the planet. Pressure in the Mariana Trench is not experienced as impact or collision. It is constant, patient, and absolute, pressing inward from every direction at once without pause. At approximately 36,000 feet below sea level, the surrounding water exerts roughly 1,086 atmospheres of pressure. Every square inch carries more than 16,000 pounds of force. Human bodies exposed directly to such conditions would fail almost instantly, not because the ocean is violent there, but because biology evolved at the surface where pressure is comparatively gentle and stable. What makes hadal life remarkable is not merely that organisms endure this force, but that the smallest structures inside their cells continue functioning normally within it. Pressure does not only threaten bones or outer tissues, it acts continuously at the molecular level, distorting the chemistry required for life itself. Every membrane, every protein, every delicate folded structure inside a living cell exists under conditions that should interfere with ordinary biological function. Cell membranes are among the first systems affected. These thin lipid layers surround every cell on Earth, regulating what enters and leaves while maintaining the internal environment necessary for metabolism. Under extreme pressure, membranes begin behaving much as they do in intense cold. They stiffen and lose flexibility. Molecules embedded within them can no longer move or interact efficiently, disrupting transport systems and communication between cellular structures. A membrane that becomes too rigid effectively stops functioning as a living boundary. Deep-sea organisms counter this problem through chemistry woven directly into their tissues. Their cell membranes contain unusually high concentrations of unsaturated fatty acids, molecules whose bent structural shapes prevent tight packing under pressure. Even in the hadal zone, these membranes remain comparatively fluid, preserving the dynamic motion necessary for cellular activity. The adaptation is subtle at the molecular scale, yet without it, the cells of trench organisms would become chemically immobilized beneath the Pacific. Proteins face a similar challenge. Nearly every biological process depends upon proteins folded into precise three-dimensional forms. Enzymes catalyze reactions only because their surfaces possess exact shapes capable of interacting with other molecules. Under immense pressure, those forms begin deforming. Chemical bonds shift. Proteins partially unfold or compress into dysfunctional arrangements, interrupting the reactions necessary for metabolism, repair, movement, and reproduction. Many trench organisms stabilize these structures using trimethylamine oxide, the compound already known to accumulate in deep-sea fish. TMAO acts as a molecular counterbalance against pressure-induced deformation, helping proteins maintain their correct, folded shapes even under enormous compression. Yet, as researchers discovered with hadal snailfish, this solution appears limited. Beyond certain concentrations, TMAO itself interferes with cellular chemistry, suggesting a theoretical boundary to how deep vertebrate life should be able to function. The trench continues, hinting that evolution may have found additional solutions beyond that boundary. Some hadal organisms produce proteins fundamentally different from those found in their shallow water relatives. These pressure-adapted variants fold along alternative pathways and remain stable under conditions that would denature ordinary proteins almost immediately. Rather than merely protecting conventional biology from pressure, the organisms appear to possess biochemistry built specifically for pressure as a normal operating condition. Researchers now study these molecules closely because their unusual stability carries enormous industrial value. Enzymes functioning under conditions that destroy standard biological catalysts could transform chemical manufacturing processes requiring extreme temperatures, solvents, or pressure environments. Pressure-stable proteins, isolated from deep ocean organisms, are already being reverse-engineered for pharmaceutical development, industrial chemistry, and biotechnology applications where conventional enzymes fail too quickly to remain practical. Beneath these applied questions lies a more fundamental uncertainty. Biology still does not know whether a final depth limit for life actually exists. The Mariana Trench approaches the greatest naturally occurring pressures found within Earth's oceans, yet organisms continue functioning there in ways once considered improbable. Every time researchers calculate a likely biochemical ceiling, the hadal zone seems to place living systems slightly beyond it. If a trench deeper than Challenger Deep existed somewhere on Earth, life might persist there as well. Current evidence offers no confirmed hard boundary where pressure alone makes biology impossible. Instead, the trench suggests something quieter and more difficult to define, that evolution continues adapting molecular systems into ranges human theory repeatedly underestimated, reshaping life patiently around conditions once assumed entirely uninhabitable. The water resting at the bottom of the Mariana Trench began its journey long before modern civilization existed. It is not freshly descended seawater moving quickly downward from recent storms or changing tides. The hadal zone is filled instead with ancient water masses carried slowly through the planet's deep circulation system, a global process oceanographers call the thermohaline conveyor. Driven by differences in temperature and salinity, this circulation moves seawater across entire ocean basins over spans measured not in years but in centuries. Near polar regions, surface water cools, grows denser, and sinks toward the deep ocean carrying dissolved oxygen absorbed from the atmosphere. From there, the water begins an extraordinarily gradual migration through abyssal currents circulating around the planet. Long before it reaches the Mariana Trench, the water may pass beneath drifting ice, move through distant ocean basins, and descend across layers of darkness extending for miles below the surface. Isotope analysis suggests that portions of the water eventually entering the hadal zone of the trench last touched the atmosphere roughly 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. The molecules surrounding organisms at the bottom may therefore have been exposed to sunlight during the medieval period, before industrialization, before transoceanic exploration reshaped global history, before many modern nations existed in recognizable form. The trench is filled with seawater carrying the chemical memory of a much older Earth. Even the oxygen dissolved within that water is ancient. Deep-sea organisms breathing in the hadal zone rely upon oxygen that may have exchanged with the atmosphere more than a millennium earlier. Unlike shallow coastal waters, where storms, waves, and circulation replenish dissolved gases constantly, the deepest Pacific receives renewal only through the immense slowness of thermohaline circulation. Once oxygen arrives at depth, biological activity gradually consumes it, and replacement occurs only over very long timescales. In some sections of the trench, this process creates oxygen minimum zones, layers where dissolved oxygen falls to critically low concentrations. These regions form biological bottlenecks within an already severe environment. Organisms entering them encounter metabolic limits imposed not by pressure or darkness alone, but by simple scarcity of breathable oxygen suspended in the water itself. Certain microbial communities persist there through specialized chemistry, while larger animals often become sparse or absent across the most depleted zones. The chemistry of ancient deep water differs subtly but significantly from modern surface seawater. Dissolved gas ratios shift over time as respiration and chemical reactions alter composition during the water's centuries-long journey through the ocean interior. Mineral concentrations vary, acidity changes gradually. Carbon accumulates from biological decomposition occurring far above. By the time the water reaches Challenger Deep, it represents a stable chemical environment shaped by immense temporal isolation from the atmosphere. Life within the trench has adapted to that stability. Hadal organisms evolved inside water masses, whose chemistry changes so slowly that environmental conditions remain comparatively constant across evolutionary timescales. Temperature fluctuates little, dissolved gases shift gradually, sunlight never penetrates deeply enough to create daily or seasonal cycles. The trench is not only physically isolated, but chemically insulated from the rapid variability of the surface world. Yet, the separation is not permanent. Changes occurring in the modern ocean eventually propagate downward through the same circulation system that delivers ancient water into the abyss. Carbon dioxide absorbed at the surface slowly alters deep ocean acidity as those waters descend and circulate through the planet. Warming temperatures influence oxygen content and circulation strength. Industrial pollutants introduced centuries ago have already reached the trench floor, carried invisibly through marine systems over time. The consequences unfold slowly enough that no human lifetime can observe the complete process directly. A chemical shift beginning at the surface today may not fully arrive within parts of the Mariana Trench for hundreds of years. The hadal ecosystem therefore exists, partly inside a delayed version of Earth, inhabiting water shaped by climatic and atmospheric conditions from distant centuries, while gradually moving toward a future chemistry generated far above. There is something almost geological about that rhythm. Creatures drifting through the trench breathe oxygen from another era while suspended inside water older than many human institutions. Around them, the Pacific continues its vast circulation quietly and continuously, carrying the history of the surface downward through darkness, 1 century at a time. At the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the seafloor gathers material so slowly that a human lifetime leaves almost no visible trace within it. Fine particles drift downward through the Pacific and settle gently across the hadal plain, building layers measured not by seasons or centuries, but by geological ages. The sediment resembles ordinary mud when illuminated by submersible lights, pale and soft beneath the water, yet it functions more like an archive assembled grain by grain across immense stretches of planetary history. Deposition occurs at an extraordinarily slow rate, roughly 1 centimeter every 1,000 years in some regions of the trench. A thin layer, no deeper than a fingernail, may contain events separated by generations of human civilization. Because the accumulation is so gradual and the environment remains relatively undisturbed, the sediment preserves chemical and biological information with remarkable continuity. Time settles there physically, compressed into layered sequences beneath the Pacific floor. When researchers extract sediment cores from the trench, they recover long cylinders of compacted material arranged chronologically from top to bottom. The uppermost layers contain the most recent centuries, while deeper sections descend backward through millions of years of ocean history. Each layer carries fragments from distant environments transported gradually into the abyss. Winds carried continental pollen grains out over the Pacific long before they sank into hadal sediment. Volcanic eruptions spread microscopic ash through the atmosphere before it drifted downward into the trench. Tiny micrometeorites from space settled invisibly through seawater and became embedded within the accumulating layers alongside fossilized microorganisms and mineral particles. The trench floor records changes that unfolded across the entire planet. Chemical ratios preserved within sediment reveal shifts in ocean temperature, circulation strength, and biological productivity extending deep into Earth's past. By analyzing oxygen isotopes, carbon content, and trace elements trapped within microscopic shells, researchers reconstruct climates that existed millions of years before humans appeared. The deepest place in the ocean became, almost accidentally, one of the most detailed long-term environmental records on Earth. Some layers preserve moments of abrupt planetary catastrophe. Sediment extracted from the trench contains a distinct iridium-rich boundary associated with the asteroid impact approximately 66 million years ago that ended the age of non-avian dinosaurs. Iridium is relatively uncommon within Earth's crust, but abundant in many extraterrestrial objects. When the asteroid struck, enormous quantities of debris entered the atmosphere and spread globally before settling through the oceans. Even within the remote darkness of the Mariana Trench, that ancient impact remains visible as a thin chemical horizon buried beneath miles of water and millions of years of accumulated sediment. More recent human history also appears clearly within the layers. Beginning in the 1950s, artificial radionuclides from atmospheric nuclear weapons testing became incorporated into marine sediment worldwide. Particles released into the atmosphere eventually descended through the ocean and settled across the trench floor, creating a radioactive marker horizon identifiable even at hadal depth. The sediment quietly recorded the arrival of the nuclear age in one of the most isolated environments on the planet. Microplastics entered the archive soon afterward. Layers corresponding to the middle decades of the 20th century begin containing synthetic polymer fragments carried downward from surface pollution. Through subsequent decades, the concentration increases sharply, forming a geological signature of industrial civilization embedded permanently within the abyssal mud. The trench, despite its remoteness, continues collecting the material evidence of human activity from across the Pacific Basin. Researchers now use this layered record to study long-term ocean circulation, extinction events, volcanic history, and climate transitions spanning tens of millions of years. Each sediment core functions almost like a timeline written chemically into the seafloor itself. Tiny variations in mineral composition or biological remains reveal shifts in ancient currents, changing temperatures, or collapses in marine ecosystems far above. There is something unusual about the relationship between remoteness and preservation in the Mariana Trench. The same isolation that makes the hadal zone difficult to explore also protects its sedimentary record from many disturbances common elsewhere. While surface environments are eroded continuously by weather, tectonics, and biological activity, the trench floor accumulates memory patiently in darkness. The deepest place on Earth became not only a refuge for unfamiliar life, but one of the planet's quietest and most complete archives of its own history. Long before most people ever heard the word bloop, the Pacific Ocean had already been speaking through an immense underwater listening system stretched quietly across the basin. Hydrophones anchored deep beneath the sea, recorded vibrations moving through water over thousands of miles, preserving sounds generated by earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, shifting ice, submarines, storms, whales, and countless other sources impossible to see directly. Much of the ocean communicates through acoustics. In darkness, sound travels farther and more efficiently than light ever can. The listening network itself was never intended for ocean science. It originated as military infrastructure during the Cold War, designed primarily to detect Soviet submarines moving beneath the Pacific. After geopolitical priorities shifted, portions of the system became available for scientific monitoring. Researchers inherited an acoustic archive, unlike anything previously assembled, a continuous record of underwater sound extending across enormous regions of the planet. Within that archive were signals that resisted explanation. One of the most persistent became known as the upsweep, a strange seasonal sound recorded repeatedly since the early 1990s. It consists of a long, rising tonal pattern repeating at regular intervals, almost like a distant mechanical resonance, slowly climbing in pitch before fading again into background ocean noise. Analysts identified no confirmed biological source, geological process, or human activity matching its acoustic profile precisely. The signal appears strongest during northern hemisphere, spring, and autumn, suggesting some relationship to seasonal ocean dynamics, yet no definitive mechanism has been established. Then came the slowdown. Recorded in 1997, the sound descended gradually in frequency across approximately 7 minutes before stopping entirely. Unlike abrupt seismic events or known whale vocalizations, the signal changed slowly and continuously, as though the source itself were decelerating through the water. Researchers compared it against catalogs of earthquakes, volcanic activity, ice movements, and marine animal sounds without finding a convincing match. That same year, the network captured another anomaly known simply as the whistle. The recording lasted only briefly. A pure-toned acoustic event, strikingly regular in structure. Its precision suggested machinery rather than biology, yet no registered vessels or equipment were known to be operating within the region at the time. The signal appeared once and never repeated. In 1999 came the Julia, a low moaning sound lasting roughly 15 seconds. Scientists working with the hydrophone data described it as unlike anything already documented within the catalog. The prevailing interpretation eventually leaned toward a large iceberg grounding somewhere along the Antarctic region, producing deep, resonant friction against the seafloor. Yet even this explanation remained tentative rather than fully confirmed. The acoustic signature resembled no perfectly documented comparison event. All of these sounds emerged from the same imperfect listening system spread across the Pacific Basin. Its sensitivity varies depending on frequency and environmental conditions. Coverage remains incomplete. Acoustic shadows, background noise, and limitations in recording resolution complicate interpretation constantly. The network was adapted for strategic surveillance, not comprehensive biological or geological mapping of the ocean's soundscape. Researchers analyzing the recordings often work retrospectively, sorting through enormous archives gathered originally for entirely different purposes. Large portions of that archive remain only partially studied. There are almost certainly recordings, never fully analyzed, signals overlooked because they did not fit immediate research priorities or because the tools required for interpretation did not yet exist. The Pacific generates a continuous acoustic environment beyond the capacity of any single institution to catalog completely. What makes ocean acoustics especially difficult is that sound in water behaves differently than in air. Temperature layers, salinity gradients, pressure changes, and seafloor topography bend and channel acoustic waves across extraordinary distances. A sound produced thousands of miles away may arrive distorted, amplified, or redirected through underwater sound channels, acting almost like invisible corridors beneath the sea. Determining origin becomes an exercise in probability rather than certainty. The result is an ocean whose acoustic ecology remains largely unmapped despite decades of recording. Beneath the Pacific exists a world defined as much by sound as by geography, an environment where organisms, geological systems, shifting ice, and unknown processes generate signals moving silently through darkness across entire basins. The hydrophones continue listening there continuously, gathering vibrations from places few humans have visited, preserving brief moments of underwater sound whose sources may remain unresolved for years, decades, or perhaps indefinitely. The lights of a remotely operated vehicle do not illuminate the deep ocean the way sunlight illuminates the surface world. At hadal depth, the beams reach only a short distance before dissolving into suspended particles and black water. Beyond that narrow cone of visibility, the Mariana Trench remains almost entirely hidden. Operators sitting aboard research vessels watch live video feeds filled mostly with darkness, sediment, and occasional pale organisms, drifting briefly into frame before disappearing again beyond the limits of the cameras. In 2020, one research team conducting an ROV survey within the Mariana system recorded footage that generated quiet but persistent discussion among marine biologists. The vehicle was operating at approximately 23,000 feet when something moved near the edge of the light field. The shape appeared elongated and several meters in length, visible only briefly before fading back into darkness beyond the camera range. The footage itself was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There was no sharp reveal, no clear outline suspended motionless before the lens. Instead, the object appeared partially obscured at the boundary between illumination and black water, moving with a smoothness that made interpretation difficult. Based on comparison with known equipment dimensions visible within the frame, the shape was estimated to be several meters long, larger than most confirmed hadal organisms routinely observed at that depth. Researchers reviewing the recording could not match the movement pattern or silhouette cleanly to any documented species from the trench. The video was circulated informally among marine biologists at several institutions, producing a range of interpretations rather than consensus. Some specialists suggested the object was likely a large siphonophore, a colonial organism composed of genetically identical individuals functioning together as a single drifting entity. Certain siphonophores are known to reach extraordinary lengths, extending more than 150 feet through the water column while remaining fragile and nearly transparent. Yet siphonophores are rarely documented at hadal depths, and the footage quality prevented definitive identification. Resolution dropped sharply near the edge of the light field, leaving only partial movement and indistinct structure visible. Without clearer imagery, no formal species assignment could be made confidently. The recording was discussed at a conference presentation but never published within a peer-reviewed journal. It remains part of the informal scientific record, acknowledged but unresolved. What gives the incident broader significance is not the footage alone, but how often similar reports emerge quietly from deep ocean expeditions. Multiple ROV operators working in hadal environments have described glimpsing movement beyond the visible range of their cameras. Sediment sometimes lifts from the seafloor without an immediately identifiable source entering frame. Large biological forms appear briefly at the edge of visibility before disappearing into darkness too quickly for documentation. Most of these observations never become public controversies because the evidence rarely reaches a standard sufficient for formal publication. Part of the difficulty lies in the environment itself. Cameras operating beneath miles of water face severe technical constraints. Light scatters rapidly through suspended particles. Pressure limits equipment design. Communication bandwidth restricts real-time image transmission quality. The visible field remains narrow compared to the enormous surrounding volume of water. In practical terms, researchers exploring the trench observe only tiny illuminated windows inside a much larger unseen environment. The organisms themselves may also contribute to the ambiguity. Many deep-sea animals possess translucent or gelatinous tissues that reflect little light and become nearly invisible outside direct illumination. A large siphonophore drifting just beyond the strongest part of the beam might appear only as a shifting distortion against darkness. Other unknown or poorly documented species could behave similarly, remaining difficult to resolve with present equipment. The hadal zone, therefore, remains partly constrained not by absence of life, but by the limitations of observation itself. Instruments capable of producing higher resolution imaging under full ocean depth conditions are still being developed. Improved low-light sensors, autonomous tracking systems, and longer duration deployments may eventually clarify encounters that currently remain uncertain. For now, much of the deepest Pacific continues existing at the edge of visibility. The cameras descend into darkness, illuminate a small portion of water and sediment, then return again, carrying brief fragments of observation from a place still larger and less resolved than the technology used to explore it. The photograph itself was almost ordinary at first glance. Resting against the sediment at Challenger Deep was a thin white object partially folded into the mud, illuminated by the lights of a deep ocean vehicle. There were no dramatic movements around it, no biological spectacle unfolding nearby. Yet the object did not belong to the hadal world. It was a plastic shopping bag, the kind commonly used in supermarkets during the 1980s and 1990s, carried somehow through the Pacific until it reached the deepest known point on Earth. The image was captured in 2018 at approximately 36,000 feet below sea level. Humans have physically visited Challenger Deep only a handful of times in recorded history, yet a disposable bag manufactured for brief use at the surface had already arrived there independently. The trench floor, isolated beneath crushing pressure and permanent darkness, had become part of the modern industrial landscape without ever participating in it directly. Researchers studying contamination within the Mariana system soon discovered the photograph represented only a visible fraction of a much larger process. A study published in 2019 reported that concentrations of microplastics within trench sediment exceeded those measured in heavily polluted coastal waters near major industrial regions of China. Tiny synthetic fragments, fibers, and particles had accumulated within the hadal environment at levels far beyond what earlier assumptions about ocean isolation predicted. Plastic behaves differently in the deep ocean than it does near the surface. In shallow water, sunlight gradually weakens many polymers through ultraviolet radiation, while waves and physical abrasion fragment larger debris into smaller pieces. The process is slow even there, often requiring decades. At hadal depth, however, the conditions driving breakdown almost disappear entirely. No ultraviolet light penetrates the trench. Water temperatures remain near freezing. Physical disturbance is minimal across much of the seafloor. Plastic arriving within the Mariana system may therefore persist for geological timescales. Some researchers estimate that certain polymers buried within hadal sediment could remain recognizable for millions of years. Objects designed originally for minutes of practical use at the surface become semi-permanent components of one of the most stable environments on Earth. The trench transforms modern waste into part of the long-term sedimentary record. The contamination does not remain separate from biology. Organisms feeding within the trench ingest microplastic particles alongside organic material settling through the water column. Amphipods consume contaminated detritus drifting into the abyss. Sea cucumbers process sediment containing synthetic fibers and microscopic polymer fragments. Polychaete worms burrow through layers where plastic particles have become incorporated into the mud itself. Over time, these materials enter living tissue within organisms already adapted to one of the most chemically unusual ecosystems on the planet. What these contaminants do to hadal biology across long periods remains largely unknown. Scientists possess no historical baseline describing trench ecosystems before widespread industrial pollution reached the deep ocean. By the time many species were first sampled systematically, contamination had already arrived. Researchers therefore study organisms altered by plastics and synthetic chemicals without fully knowing what unaltered hadal ecology originally looked like. The geometry of the trench intensifies the problem further. Its vast funnel-shaped structure naturally concentrates sinking material from across the Pacific Basin. Organic debris, sediment, chemical pollutants, and plastic fragments descending through the water column gradually accumulate within the deepest regions. The trench acts less like an isolated pocket and more like a collection system integrated into planetary ocean circulation. As long as plastic continues entering the Pacific, portions of it will continue settling eventually into hadal environments. Unlike coastal pollution, there is no practical mechanism for removal once debris reaches these depths. Human-engineered cleanup systems cannot operate efficiently across the trench floor under such pressure and remoteness. Natural degradation processes proceed extremely slowly. The contamination therefore persists, not as a temporary disturbance, but as a nearly permanent alteration of the ecosystem itself. There is something quietly unsettling about how complete the process has become. Plastic, manufactured briefly at the surface, now rests inside sediment older than recorded civilization, drifting among organisms evolved under conditions almost unchanged for millions of years. The deepest place on Earth, once imagined as unreachable and untouched, continues collecting the physical residue of human activity grain by grain in the darkness beneath the Pacific. Nothing at the bottom of the Mariana Trench moves quickly. Across the hadal plain, beneath the weight of ancient water and permanent darkness, most visible life advances with almost geological patience. Yet the floor is never truly still. Countless organisms spend their entire existence processing the slow rain of matter descending from the world above, turning death into continuity with movements so gradual they resemble the motion of sediment itself. In some surveyed regions of the trench floor, sea cucumbers account for nearly 90% of the visible animal biomass. They drift across the mud in pale clusters, soft bodies pressing gently into the sediment as they feed. These are holothurians, distant relatives of starfish and sea urchins, though at hadal depth they seem less like recognizable animals and more like living extensions of the seafloor. Some are translucent white, others faintly pink or gray beneath the lights of descending vehicles. Many leave winding feeding trails behind them, narrow paths etched into the sediment where the uppermost layer has been swallowed, processed, and released again. Their work appears simple at first glance. A sea cucumber ingests mud, extracts tiny traces of organic material from within it, then excretes cleaned sediment behind itself. Yet across decades, entire populations gradually overturn enormous portions of the trench floor. The upper layer of hadal sediment, where organic matter first settles and microbial activity remains highest, is continuously recycled by these quiet movements. Between them move polychaete worms, bristle-covered burrowers threading through the sediment in narrow tunnels invisible from above. Their bodies stir oxygen downward into layers that would otherwise remain chemically stagnant. As they feed and tunnel, they reshape the physical structure of the mud itself, opening microscopic pathways through which dissolved nutrients and gases can circulate. The trench floor, despite its still appearance, remains biologically active because these organisms keep it permeable and chemically connected. Covering nearly every surface in extraordinary abundance are foraminifera, single-celled organisms protected by delicate shells assembled from minerals in the surrounding sediment. Some are almost unimaginably small, while others at hadal depth grow large enough to become visible against the mud as pale grains and branching forms. They exist in such numbers that portions of the trench floor resemble living microbial cities spread across the darkness. Around and within them flourish bacteria and archaea, forming the deepest layers of the food web, metabolizing compounds released through the constant breakdown of sinking organic matter. Together, these organisms perform a function so essential that the ecosystem depends entirely upon it. Marine snow, descending into the trench, cannot simply accumulate untouched. Dead plankton, fragments of tissue, fecal particles, shed shells, and drifting biological debris must be dismantled continuously, molecule by molecule, or the chemistry of the hadal environment would change fundamentally. Sea cucumbers, worms, microbes, and foraminifera convert this material back into usable nutrients, releasing compounds once locked inside dead matter into the surrounding water and sediment where life can use them again. Researchers studying trench ecology have become increasingly interested in how efficiently this recycling occurs. Early evidence suggests hadal ecosystems may process organic matter more completely than many shallower marine environments. The shape of the trench itself may help drive this efficiency. Its funnel-like structure concentrates descending material into relatively confined regions, creating dense zones of biological processing where organisms evolved specifically to exploit every possible trace of energy arriving from above. Very little within the Mariana Trench is wasted. Organic particles drifting downward for weeks through black water are intercepted, consumed, transformed, and redistributed by communities that rarely appear in photographs or headlines. The dramatic discoveries of the hadal zone often emerge from these quieter foundations, from animals and microorganisms carrying out continuous labor beneath the sediment surface. In the deepest ocean, survival depends less on speed or strength than on the patient recycling of everything that falls from the distant world above. Far beneath the drifting currents and descending sediment, the Mariana Trench is being reshaped continuously by forces moving at speeds too slow for human senses to notice. The seafloor there is not settled terrain. It is part of an active boundary between immense sections of Earth's crust, locked together under pressure while the planet gradually folds itself inward. The Pacific Plate moves westward and downward beneath the smaller Mariana Plate at a rate of roughly 2.5 inches each year. Across the span of a single lifetime, the motion appears insignificant. Across millions of years, It has carved the deepest known depression in the ocean and altered the structure of the surrounding Pacific basin. The trench itself exists because one slab of Earth is sinking beneath another, descending into the mantle where heat and pressure slowly transform solid rock into something softer and more fluid. As the Pacific plate bends downward into the trench, it fractures under its own stress. Long cracks spread across the descending crust, forming fault systems along the trench walls and beneath the surrounding seafloor. These fractures shift unpredictably. Some release energy suddenly through earthquakes, sharp enough to ripple across the Pacific. Others move with extraordinary slowness, sliding over days or weeks in events now known as slow earthquakes. Unlike conventional seismic ruptures, these movements unfold almost silently, difficult to detect without extremely sensitive instruments positioned nearby. The Mariana system remains only sparsely monitored compared to continental fault zones closer to human populations. Vast regions of the trench floor contain no permanent instruments at all. Many seismic events occurring there are recorded only indirectly by distant monitoring stations thousands of miles away. Even now, researchers possess only fragmentary observations of how stress accumulates and releases across the hadal environment. Yet the geological motion never stops. Beneath the sediment and darkness, entire sections of crust continue descending into the planet. Along with the rock, enormous quantities of seawater are pulled downward as well. Ocean water seeps into fractures within the Pacific plate over millions of years, becoming trapped deep inside minerals and porous stone. When that plate sinks into hotter regions below the trench, the trapped water is gradually released again through chemical reactions driven by rising temperature and pressure. Scientists estimate the Mariana subduction system transports more water into Earth's mantle each year than any other known subduction zone on the planet. The scale of this hidden transfer is difficult to imagine. Part of the global water cycle, usually associated with clouds, rivers, rain, and oceans, extends far beneath the surface into the interior of the Earth itself. Water descending through the trench may remain trapped underground for immense spans of geological time before returning through volcanic systems elsewhere. Some of that returning water contributes to volcanic activity along the Mariana Arc, a chain of underwater and island volcanoes curving parallel to the trench. As fluids rise from the descending plate, they lower the melting temperature of surrounding mantle rock, generating magma that eventually pushes upward toward the surface. The quiet islands scattered above the western Pacific are connected directly to the hidden geological descent occurring far below them. The trench therefore functions not merely as a deep valley in the ocean floor, but as an active engine within the planet's larger systems. Rock sinks, fractures spread, pressure accumulates, water descends, magma rises. These processes continue regardless of weather, season, or human presence, operating through timescales so vast they blur the distinction between movement and stillness. Even in darkness deeper than sunlight can reach, the Earth remains in motion. The walls of the trench hold stress that may release tomorrow or centuries from now. Beneath the sediment where sea cucumbers move slowly across the mud, tectonic plates continue their descent into the mantle, carrying pieces of the ocean downward through the living machinery of the planet itself. Long before a vehicle ever reaches the floor of the Mariana Trench, the engineering challenge has already entered a realm where familiar rules begin to fail. The deepest ocean is often compared to outer space, yet in some ways it is even less forgiving. A spacecraft protects its occupants from vacuum. A hadal submersible must survive the full weight of the ocean pressing inward from every direction at once. Inside a crude deep-sea vehicle, Pressure remains close to a single atmosphere, calm enough for human breathing and ordinary instruments. Outside, at full ocean depth, the surrounding water presses with more than 1,000 atmospheres of force. Every surface, bolt, seal, cable, and viewing port exists under continuous compression powerful enough to crush conventional machinery instantly. Even microscopic flaws in metal become dangerous. A single structural weakness can propagate through a pressure hull in fractions of a second. For decades, most remotely operated vehicles were never designed to descend beyond roughly 20,000 feet. The Mariana Trench extends far deeper than that, into conditions requiring entirely different engineering philosophies. Materials behave differently there. Electronics fail unpredictably. Lubricants thicken. Glass cracks. Air spaces collapse. Even simple mechanical movements become difficult to sustain when surrounded by pressure measured in thousands of pounds against every square inch. A small number of full ocean depth vehicles have been built, each representing years of specialized design and enormous financial cost. One of the most advanced was the Woods Hole vehicle Nereus, created specifically to explore the deepest trenches on Earth. In the year 2014, while operating at approximately 31,000 feet in the Kermadec Trench, Nereus imploded. Contact ended suddenly. Debris later drifted upward through the water column, fragments of a machine destroyed by the environment it had been engineered to survive. Communication presents another problem. Radio waves do not travel effectively through seawater, leaving acoustic transmission as the primary method for sending information between the surface and a deep vehicle. Sound travels slowly underwater compared to electronic communication through air or space. The available bandwidth is extremely limited, and trench walls distort returning signals through reflection and scattering. Commands sent downward may arrive delayed. Data returning upward can become fragmented or corrupted by the complex geography of the hadal environment. Because of these limitations, high-definition live video from the trench floor remains extraordinarily difficult. Images often must be stored locally within the vehicle itself and retrieved only after ascent. The cameras capturing those images require custom housings machined from thick titanium or specialized ceramics capable of enduring continuous compression without deforming. Lighting systems face similar demands. Ordinary electronics fail rapidly at hadal depth, where pressure infiltrates microscopic seams and destroys internal components. Even collecting biological samples creates complications extending far beyond retrieval itself. Organisms adapted to hadal pressure frequently cannot survive decompression during ascent. As they rise toward the surface, gases dissolved within tissues expand, cellular structures distort, and delicate biochemical balances collapse. Many deep-sea animals arrive damaged or dead before researchers can study them properly. Others alter physiologically during ascent, meaning the organism examined aboard a ship may no longer resemble the creature that existed naturally on the trench floor only hours earlier. To study hadal organisms alive under authentic conditions, laboratories require pressure chambers capable of sustaining more than 1,000 atmospheres continuously. Such systems are rare, expensive, and technically difficult to operate. Fewer than 10 facilities worldwide possess the equipment necessary to maintain these environments for extended biological research. For all the sophistication of modern science, the Mariana Trench remains partly hidden not because humans lack curiosity, but because the physical conditions resist observation at nearly every step. The darkness can be illuminated. The depth can be measured. but simply surviving long enough to watch, record, and understand what exists there continues to push human technology toward its limits beneath the weight of the deepest ocean on Earth. Every descent into the Mariana Trench returns with evidence that the deepest ocean is far more populated than earlier generations of researchers imagined. The pattern has repeated with unusual consistency across decades of exploration. Cameras reveal unfamiliar forms moving across the sediment. Sample traps rise, carrying organisms no catalog fully recognizes. Genetic sequencing uncovers biological lineages that diverged from known relatives long ago in isolation beneath the Pacific. Before the 1990s, confirmed records of life from hadal depths within the Mariana system were remarkably sparse. Fewer than 20 species had been reliably documented from the deepest regions of the trench. The hadal zone was often described in scientific literature as biologically limited, a harsh environment where only a narrow collection of specialized organisms could survive. The assumption seemed reasonable at the time. Very little direct observation existed, and the technical barriers to sampling at full depth restricted nearly every expedition. As vehicles improved and cameras descended farther into the trench, that assumption began to dissolve. Species counts climbed steadily. Amphipods appeared in greater diversity than expected. New worms emerged from sediment cores. Previously unknown microorganisms multiplied under laboratory analysis. Snailfish occupied ecological roles once thought impossible for vertebrates at those depths. With each expedition, the biological map of the trench became more crowded rather than more complete. Current confirmed species counts now exceed 200 within the Mariana hadal environment alone, and researchers widely acknowledge that this number represents only a small, visible fraction of the ecosystem's actual diversity. In the year 2023, a single expedition recovered multiple previously unidentified species of polychaete worms, amphipods, and foraminifera from a limited survey area. The discovery rate has not slowed with time. It has accelerated as imaging systems, deep-sea robotics, and genetic sequencing methods continue improving. Much of the challenge now lies not in finding organisms, but in processing the growing backlog of specimens already collected. Taxonomists, the scientists responsible for formally describing and naming species, work through trench material accumulated across decades of expeditions. Some biological samples recovered during the 1990s remain undescribed even now, preserved in research collections awaiting detailed analysis. A small translucent crustacean or fragile worm extracted from hadal sediment may represent an entirely new species, yet confirming that possibility requires years of comparative work involving anatomy, genetics, and classification. In some cases, researchers suspect they are observing not merely new species, but entirely unfamiliar branches within existing evolutionary groups. The isolation of trench habitats encourages divergence over immense periods of time. Populations separated by underwater ridges, depth boundaries, or chemistry differences may evolve independently for millions of years, producing forms found nowhere else in the ocean. Estimating the true biodiversity of the hadal zone has therefore become extremely difficult. Different scientific models vary enormously. Some suggest the deepest trenches contain relatively modest but highly specialized ecosystems. Others argue the hadal environment may harbor one of the greatest reservoirs of undiscovered species on Earth. A number of biologists now cautiously propose that the deep ocean floor, including the trench systems scattered across the Pacific, could rival or exceed tropical rainforests in total undiscovered biodiversity. The comparison feels counterintuitive because the trench appears visually sparse under artificial light. There are no forests, coral reefs, or visible blooms of color. Yet, complexity does not always announce itself through abundance visible at human scale. Much of the trench ecosystem exists in layers, difficult to perceive directly, within microbial films, buried sediment communities, drifting larvae, soft-bodied invertebrates, and organisms so fragile they disintegrate during retrieval. The Mariana Trench is therefore not an empty abyss occupied by occasional survivors. It is a crowded biological system operating beyond ordinary observation, filled with evolutionary histories still unnamed. Every expedition descends into a world where the catalog remains unfinished, where species continue emerging from darkness faster than science can formally describe them, and where the deepest ocean still holds far more life than humans have yet learned to count. Far below the familiar geography of continents and coastlines, the deepest trenches of the Pacific exist like scattered islands separated not by land, but by differences in depth. The Mariana Trench does not connect continuously to the Tonga Trench, the Kermadec Trench, or the deep Philippine systems through uninterrupted hadal terrain. Between them stretch thousands of miles of seafloor, rising above the hadal threshold, forming barriers that organisms adapted to extreme pressure may not easily cross. For life shaped by the deepest ocean, even a few thousand feet of reduced pressure may represent an entirely different environment. Creatures evolved specifically for hadal depths are biochemically tuned to conditions that exist only within the deepest trenches. Their proteins, membranes, and metabolic systems operate under pressures that would destabilize many shallow water relatives. Moving upward through the water column, even slightly in geological terms, may expose them to conditions outside their biological tolerances. This raises one of the most important evolutionary questions in deep ocean biology. Are hadal populations isolated from one another, evolving independently within separate trenches for millions of years, or does some hidden mechanism still connect them across the Pacific Basin? Early genetic studies appeared to support the isolation model. Organisms collected from the Mariana Trench often differed genetically from outwardly similar species inhabiting other trenches. Amphipods that looked nearly identical under visual examination sometimes revealed substantial genetic divergence once sequenced in laboratories. The implication was striking. Trenches separated by vast distances may function as isolated evolutionary chambers, each producing its own distinct biological lineages despite similar environmental pressures. If this interpretation is correct, then different trenches may contain organisms independently evolving towards similar ecological roles through convergent evolution. Separate populations, exposed to comparable darkness, pressure, and food limitation, could gradually arrive at related body plans and survival strategies without recent genetic exchange between them. A translucent amphipod in one trench and a nearly identical amphipod in another might not be close relatives at all, but parallel solutions produced by the same environmental demands. More recent research, however, has complicated that picture. Genetic analyses of some hadal amphipod populations revealed unexpected similarity between trenches separated by thousands of miles. Certain organisms appeared far less isolated than researchers predicted. The deep Pacific, once imagined as a series of disconnected abyssal pockets, may possess forms of biological connectivity that remain poorly understood. How such dispersal occurs is still uncertain. One proposed explanation involves drifting organic matter descending through the ocean. Whale carcasses, massive logs, and large accumulations of debris sink slowly toward the seafloor, becoming temporary islands of concentrated nutrients within the deep ocean. Amphipods or larvae attached to these descending structures might travel enormous distances passively before settling into new hadal environments. Over geological timescales, even rare events of this kind could permit genetic exchange between distant trench populations. Another possibility reaches further back into Earth's climatic history. Ocean circulation patterns have shifted repeatedly across millions of years as ice ages advanced and retreated, sea levels rose and fell, and tectonic systems rearranged the seafloor. During different circulation regimes in the distant past, deeper current pathways may have linked trenches more effectively than they do today, allowing periods of wider dispersal before populations became isolated again. The question extends beyond academic curiosity. Understanding how connected hadal ecosystems truly are has direct implications for conservation and extinction risk. If trench populations exchange genes regularly, damaged ecosystems might eventually recover through recolonization from other hadal regions. But if each trench functions as a largely isolated evolutionary world, then the loss of a single hadal ecosystem could mean the permanent disappearance of species found nowhere else on Earth. For now, the evidence remains incomplete. Genetic sequences reveal fragments of hidden relationships, while the geography of the deep Pacific suggests profound separation. Somewhere within the darkness between trenches, the history of hadal evolution continues unfolding through migrations, isolations, extinctions, and survival pathways still only partially visible to science. Beneath the Pacific, the deepest ecosystems may be far more connected or far more alone than humans currently understand. Far above the trench floor, somewhere in the cold darkness between continents, a whale eventually stops swimming. Its body, which once crossed entire oceans powered by immense muscles and constant motion, begins a final descent through layers of water that grow steadily darker and older. For hours, sometimes days, the carcass sinks in silence. Small scavengers arrive first in the open water, trailing the falling mass downward. Then the whale disappears beneath the last reachable sunlight and continues descending alone into the deep Pacific. When it finally reaches the sea floor, the impact creates one of the most concentrated bursts of biological activity in the ocean. A whale fall is not simply a dead animal resting on the seabed. It is an ecological transformation that unfolds across years and even decades, altering the chemistry and biology of the surrounding environment in stages so consistent that marine biologists can often predict the sequence before it begins. In the deep sea, where food may drift downward only as sparse particles of marine snow, the sudden arrival of a whale carcass represents an enormous deposit of energy and organic material concentrated in a single place. The first arrivals are mobile scavengers capable of detecting dissolved compounds released into the water. Hagfish slip through openings in the flesh, feeding from within. Sleeper sharks circle slowly through the darkness. Rat-tail fish gather around exposed tissue, stripping away muscle and fat over periods lasting months. The carcass gradually changes shape as the soft body disappears, leaving ribs and vertebrae exposed against the sediment, like the remains of some ancient structure settling into ruin. As the bones emerge, a second community begins to form. Polychaete worms spread through the surrounding sediment. Small crustaceans cluster between skeletal gaps. Organisms adapted for nutrient-rich environments colonize the remains, feeding on residual organic matter trapped within the bones and surrounding mud. What began as a drifting giant from the surface ocean becomes a stationary deep-sea habitat supporting dozens of specialized species. The final stage is stranger still. Whale bones contain large quantities of lipids sealed within their structure. As bacteria begin breaking down these compounds in the oxygen-poor conditions of the deep ocean, sulfur-rich chemicals are released into the surrounding environment. Chemosynthetic microbes flourish, deriving energy not from sunlight, but from sulfur chemistry, much like the biological systems surrounding hydrothermal vents. Over time, an isolated oasis forms around the skeleton. Bacterial mats spread across bone surfaces. Small invertebrates adapted for chemically active environments settle nearby. In places otherwise defined by scarcity, the whale fall becomes a concentrated island of productivity, sustained by chemical energy emerging slowly from the remains themselves. This sulfophilic stage may persist for decades. Because of this unusual ecological progression, some scientists have proposed that whale falls may serve as biological stepping stones across the deep ocean floor. Vent-adapted organisms that rely on chemosynthetic environments are often separated by enormous distances between hydrothermal systems. A whale carcass, descending into the abyss, may temporarily create a bridge between those isolated habitats, allowing species to disperse gradually across otherwise barren stretches of seafloor. Within the hadal zone, this possibility becomes especially intriguing. The Mariana Trench contains isolated pockets of chemically driven ecosystems separated by immense darkness and distance. If whale falls occur there with sufficient frequency, they may provide intermittent pathways for organisms moving between deep communities over evolutionary timescales. Yet, despite decades of deep-sea exploration, natural whale falls remain rarely observed. Only a handful have been documented directly anywhere in the global ocean, and none have been confirmed at full hadal depth within the Mariana Trench itself. Scientists have intentionally sunk whale carcasses in accessible deep water environments to study the process, but reproducing such experiments at 36,000 feet remains beyond current engineering capability. So the deepest whale falls remain hypothetical landscapes, unseen but possible, forming somewhere in the darkness below as ancient bodies descend slowly into the trench and begin, quietly, to feed entire worlds. Long before spacecraft ever photographed the icy surfaces of Europa or Enceladus, the deepest parts of Earth's oceans were often imagined as biological dead ends, places too dark, cold, and pressurized for anything complex to survive. The assumption seemed reasonable. On the surface world, nearly every major ecosystem ultimately traces its energy back to sunlight. Forests, coral reefs, grasslands, and plankton blooms all begin with photosynthesis, with organisms turning light into biological fuel. Without that foundation, life was expected to thin out into scattered microbial remnants and eventually disappear altogether. The Mariana Trench slowly dismantled that assumption. As research vessels lowered cameras and sampling instruments into the hadal zone, they found not only microbial survival, but entire functioning ecosystems. Amphipods gathered in dense swarms around bait deployments. Snailfish hunted along the trench floor. Chemosynthetic microbes drew energy from chemical reactions rather than sunlight, supporting communities that existed entirely outside the familiar surface relationship between life and the sun. The deeper the trench was explored, the more biology seemed willing to adapt itself into forms that earlier generations of scientists would have considered impossible. That realization quietly changed the direction of astrobiology. Europa, one of Jupiter's largest moons, is believed to contain a vast liquid ocean hidden beneath an ice shell many miles thick. The ocean remains liquid because of tidal heating, the immense gravitational pull from Jupiter flexing Europa's interior and generating heat deep below the frozen crust. No sunlight reaches that buried water. Any ecosystem there would exist in perpetual darkness beneath crushing pressure, isolated from the surface world above by ice instead of ocean depth. The resemblance to hadal environments became difficult to ignore. Enceladus, orbiting Saturn, deepened the comparison further. Spacecraft observations confirmed water vapor erupting from fractures near its south pole, carrying salts, organic molecules, and chemical compounds associated with hydrothermal reactions. Beneath the ice, evidence pointed toward a seafloor with active hydrothermal systems, an environment where chemical energy, rather than sunlight, could potentially sustain living systems. Before the biology of Earth's deep trenches became understood, many researchers assumed that extraterrestrial oceans lacking sunlight would be poor candidates for anything beyond the simplest microbial chemistry. The hadal zone forced a revision of those expectations. If multicellular organisms on Earth could survive in permanent darkness, using ecosystems built on chemical energy, then oceans beneath alien ice no longer seemed biologically implausible. The trench became more than a remote geological feature. It became an analog, a place where engineers and astrobiologists could study conditions approximating worlds far beyond Earth. The challenges overlap in striking ways. Reaching the bottom of the Mariana Trench requires vehicles capable of surviving immense pressure while operating remotely through darkness with limited communication. Reaching an ocean beneath Europa's ice would require penetrating an outer shell, potentially many miles thick, deploying instruments into an isolated sea, and transmitting information back through layers of ice and vacuum across millions of miles of space. The environments are different, but the engineering logic begins from similar constraints: pressure, isolation, communication delay, and survival in hostile conditions beyond direct human reach. NASA and the European Space Agency now study deep ocean exploration systems, partly because of these parallels. Pressure-resistant electronics, autonomous navigation systems, chemical sensors, and microbial sampling techniques developed for hadal research have direct relevance for future missions searching for life beneath extraterrestrial ice. Even the organisms themselves have become important. Enzymes isolated from trench microbes demonstrate how biology can remain functional under conditions once considered incompatible with life. Each new adaptation discovered at hadal depth slightly widens the known boundaries of biology. So, the Mariana Trench no longer exists only as the deepest place in Earth's ocean. It has become a reference point for understanding where life itself may be possible. Far below the Pacific surface, in darkness older than recorded history, the trench quietly reshaped humanity's picture of the living universe, not through speculation, but through the steady persistence of organisms, continuing to survive where survival once seemed impossible. Maps and legal boundaries give the impression of certainty. A protected region appears shaded on charts, outlined by coordinates and jurisdictional lines, as though the act of declaring protection creates distance between a place and harm. In 2009, the Marianas Trench Marine National Monument was established across roughly 95,000 square miles of ocean and seafloor surrounding the Mariana Islands. On paper, one of the deepest environments on Earth entered a category associated with preservation, scientific stewardship, and restricted exploitation. Yet, The trench exists far below the practical reach of enforcement. At 36,000 feet, there are no patrol vessels watching the sediment plains, no continuous monitoring stations spread across the hadal floor, no permanent human presence. Even scientific expeditions arrive only briefly before disappearing again into the immense Pacific above. The remoteness that protected the trench for millions of years also makes understanding and regulating change extraordinarily difficult. A disturbance may occur slowly, diffusely, and invisibly, long before researchers possess the instruments capable of measuring it. Meanwhile, the surface world continues searching the ocean floor for materials increasingly valuable to modern industry. Across the Pacific Basin, vast regions of seafloor contain polymetallic nodules rich in cobalt, nickel, manganese, and rare earth elements used in battery systems and electronic manufacturing. Deep-sea mining has emerged from speculative concept into active industrial planning. Pilot operations and exploratory surveys have already demonstrated that extracting material from abyssal sediments creates enormous plumes of suspended particles that drift through the water column before settling back onto the seafloor, sometimes hundreds of miles from the original site. In shallower, deep ocean environments, these plumes can blanket organisms adapted to stable sediment conditions, interfering with feeding structures and altering chemical balances that evolved over immense spans of geological time. For the Mariana system, however, the consequences remain largely unmodeled. Scientists still do not know whether sediment disturbances originating elsewhere in the Pacific could eventually descend into hadal environments, or how long those particles might remain suspended once they enter trench circulation. Systems. The uncertainty itself has become part of the problem. Many trench organisms evolved within extraordinarily stable conditions. Some inhabit water masses isolated from the surface for more than 1,000 years. Temperature shifts occur slowly. Sediment accumulates at rates measured across geological eras rather than human lifetimes. Chemical balances remain remarkably constant. Creatures shaped by such stability possess no known evolutionary preparation for rapid alteration in suspended sediment concentration, dissolved chemistry, or particulate contamination arriving from distant industrial activity. Even industries that never physically reach hadal depth still affect the trench indirectly. Deep-sea trawling operates thousands of feet above the hadal zone, removing fish and disturbing mid-water ecosystems that contribute organic material to the ocean below. Marine snow drifting into the trench begins its journey far above the abyssal floor. Changes to those upper ecosystems gradually propagate downward through the food web, altering the quantity and composition of material reaching the deepest environments on Earth. Climate change introduces another slower transformation. The thermohaline circulation system, carrying oxygenated surface water into the deep ocean, depends upon temperature gradients and salinity balances already beginning to shift. Because hadal water masses renew themselves over centuries, changes occurring at the surface today may not fully arrive in the trench until far in the future. Yet when they do arrive, they will enter ecosystems adapted to ancient chemical conditions that remained comparatively stable for millennia. The trench, therefore, exists in a strange position within the modern world. It is physically remote beyond ordinary human reach, yet chemically and biologically connected to planetary systems shaped increasingly by surface activity. Plastic descends into it. Pollutants accumulate within its organisms. Shifts in circulation alter the oxygen carried into its darkness. Industrial sediment, released far away, may eventually settle across its floor. The deepest place on Earth is not separate from the rest of the planet. It is downstream from all of it, a final collecting basin where the consequences of distant decisions arrive slowly, quietly, and often centuries after they begin. For all the measurements collected, all the sediment cores raised slowly through the Pacific, all the cameras lowered into darkness, and all the sonar maps stitched together from returning echoes, the Mariana Trench remains defined as much by absence as by discovery. Knowledge accumulates there in fragments. A few hours of footage, a handful of biological samples, isolated temperature readings, chemical traces preserved in mud older than civilizations. Around those fragments stretches an environment so large, deep, and difficult to access that most of it still exists outside direct observation. The list of unanswered questions is longer than the list of resolved ones. No one knows the total number of species living within the trench. Early surveys identified only a small collection of confirmed hadal organisms. As expeditions increased and instruments improved, the count climbed steadily into the hundreds, with each new mission adding more unfamiliar forms. Yet even now, taxonomic backlogs extend across decades. Specimens collected years ago remain unnamed inside laboratory archives because there are too few specialists capable of classifying them all. Some researchers suspect the total species richness may extend into the thousands, but the true number remains hidden somewhere within the sediment plains, trench walls, microbial films, and drifting darkness between them. The ecosystem itself still resists complete explanation. Scientists do not yet understand how enough energy reaches the hadal zone to support the quantity of life observed there. Marine snow alone appears insufficient according to existing models. Chemosynthetic processes may supplement the food web, but the balance between these energy sources remains unresolved. The trench continues functioning biologically in ways that exceed current accounting. Even the soundscape remains largely unknown. The deep ocean is an acoustic world where sound travels farther and more efficiently than light, yet the organisms inhabiting hadal depths have barely been studied in terms of communication or acoustic behavior. Researchers do not know what sounds many trench species produce, whether they exchange information acoustically, or how biological noise interacts with the immense geological acoustics of the Pacific Basin itself. The hydrophone archives collected over decades contain recordings still unreviewed, signals waiting silently within storage systems because no one has yet listened closely enough. Other mysteries persist in more tangible forms. Warm water anomalies continue appearing in regions lacking confirmed hydrothermal vents. Sonar surveys still occasionally produce midwater returns that match no established geological or biological explanation. The long-term biological effects of microplastics, industrial chemicals, and altered ocean chemistry remain almost entirely unstudied at hadal depth because meaningful experiments require timescales extending far beyond most research programs. There are questions preserved within history as well. Don Walsh's reported observation of a flatfish moving across the trench floor during the Trieste descent in 1960 has never been confirmed or repeated. Some scientists regard it as a misidentification under difficult viewing conditions. Others leave open the possibility that an organism not yet documented may have briefly entered the submersible's lights before vanishing again into darkness. Fundamental biological details remain missing for most hadal organisms. Researchers often do not know their full lifespans, reproductive cycles, developmental stages, migration patterns, or population sizes. Genetic studies hint at connections between trenches separated by thousands of miles, yet the mechanisms allowing such dispersal remain uncertain. Some of these questions will probably narrow with time. Instruments improve. Pressure-resistant cameras become clearer. Autonomous vehicles remain underwater longer. Genetic sequencing grows faster and more precise. Future expeditions may map regions currently known only through scattered sonar lines and isolated dives. Other mysteries may persist far longer. Exploring the deepest place on Earth requires enormous financial cost, specialized engineering, and sustained political interest, all directed toward an environment invisible to ordinary human life. The trench extends roughly 1,580 miles across the western Pacific and descends nearly 7 miles into the planet. Across all of recorded history, human beings have spent only a few total hours standing on its floor. Beyond the glow of those brief visits, most of the Mariana Trench remains exactly as it was before the first ship crossed the Pacific: dark, pressurized, alive, and still largely unknown. Long before forests spread across continents, before mammals existed, before the first feathered shapes crossed prehistoric skies, the Mariana Trench had already begun forming in the western Pacific. For roughly 180 million years, tectonic plates shifted slowly against one another, the Pacific Plate descending beneath the Mariana Plate in darkness beneath the ocean surface. The trench deepened gradually across spans of time so immense they resist ordinary comprehension. Entire branches of life appeared and vanished, while the hadal floor continued changing almost invisibly beneath ancient water. For nearly all of that history, nothing living at the surface knew the trench existed. Human civilizations emerged only within the final fraction of its existence. Languages formed, cities rose, empires expanded across continents, and astronomical observatories mapped distant stars, all while 7 miles beneath the Pacific, the trench remained untouched by observation. Its organisms continued living within conditions completely separate from human experience, without sunlight, weather, seasons, or any awareness of the world above. While Roman roads stretched across Europe, snailfish drifted through black water older than those civilizations by geological ages. While ships crossed the Atlantic and maps slowly filled with coastlines, xenophyophores assembled their immense single cells, grain by grain, along the trench floor. While wars reshaped borders and industrial cities transformed the atmosphere itself, ancient water masses continued carrying dissolved oxygen downward through the slow circulation of the deep ocean, moving across centuries before finally reaching the hadal depths. There is something profoundly humbling in that continuity. Every species discovered in the trench existed before human beings found it. None required observation to become real. The amphipods swarming through the sediment, the microbes surviving within buried mud, the translucent fish moving through darkness beneath impossible pressure, all of them completed their entire evolutionary histories independent of human knowledge. Discovery did not create them. It merely interrupted, briefly, a world already in progress. The trench quietly resists the illusion that the planet is fully known. Humanity has split the atom, walked upon the moon, decoded the structure of DNA, and built machines capable of seeing galaxies whose light began traveling before Earth itself formed. Yet, the deepest environment on our own planet still contains unanswered questions fundamental enough to reshape biology, geology, and the understanding of life itself. Scientists still do not know how many species live there, how some of them reproduce, how the ecosystem balances its energy, or what moves occasionally beyond the edge of deep ocean cameras. That uncertainty is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that reality remains larger than our maps of it. The ocean covers roughly 71% of Earth's surface, and detailed mapping exists for less than one-fifth of it. Beneath the Pacific alone are enormous regions no human eyes have directly observed. Valleys, sediment plains, microbial ecosystems, and geological structures continue existing in darkness beyond current exploration. The trench reminds us that mystery is not confined to distant galaxies or hypothetical worlds. It still exists here, on the same planet where cities glow through the night and satellites circle overhead. Somewhere below the Pacific surface, in water that last touched sunlight more than 1,000 years ago, organisms continue moving through the hadal dark at this exact moment. Pressure waves spread outward through cold water. Sediment drifts slowly downward from ecosystems far above. Ancient currents carry oxygen through trenches that formed before the first flowering plants appeared on Earth. There are sounds there no human being has heard directly. There are species still unnamed. There are biological strategies and chemical adaptations that remain completely unknown outside that darkness. And perhaps most remarkable of all, there may remain things humanity will not fully understand for generations yet to come. The trench does not offer certainty. It offers scale, patience, and perspective. It reminds us that the living world is still unfinished in human understanding, that discovery remains possible, and that somewhere beneath the oldest waters of the Pacific, the unknown is still alive.